Hey, welcome to Sleepy Old World. Before tonight's story, just one small thing. If you subscribe, this little channel will start showing up for you on its own. No searching required the next time you can't sleep. And if these stories have ever helped you drift off, a like is a quiet way of saying so. While you're getting settled, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. A quiet street somewhere in Ohio. A flat in Manchester, the city finally gone still. Somewhere warm in Brisbane, evening just settling in. Leave it in the comments, I read every single one. Alright love, let's get you comfortable. Let your shoulders drop and your legs go heavy. Are you comfortable? Good, let's go. I want to start somewhere unexpected. Not a ballroom. Not a wedding. A chemist shop on a narrow street in London in the autumn of 1881 at around 4 in the afternoon, when the light is already turning grey and thin. A young woman in a fitted wool jacket is standing at the counter, waiting while the chemist wraps a small paper packet and ties it with string. The packet contains wafers, little white tablets, pressed and smoothed, meant to be eaten one at a time daily for a clear and pale complexion. They are called, on the label, Bloom of Ninon. What the label does not say, because it does not have to, because everyone selling and buying them already half knows and has decided not to think about it too hard, is that the wafers contain arsenic. Small doses, enough to make the skin look luminous and faintly translucent. The fashionable pallor of the decade, the look that suggested a woman did not have to labour outdoors, did not have to labour at all. Enough also, over months and years, to do quiet and accumulating damage that nobody in that chemist's shop is thinking about this particular Tuesday afternoon. She pays, tucks the packet into her glove, and steps back out into the street. This was not a fringe practice. This was Regent Street. This was respectable. I want to give you a handful of these tonight, one after another, small odd true things, before we settle into any one story properly, because I think the strangeness of this century deserves a proper introduction before we slow down inside it. Stay with me. Here is another one. In a parlour in Leeds, that same autumn, a woman named Harriet Pemberton is arranging a wreath under a glass dome on her mantelpiece. It is not made of flowers, it is made of hair. Her own hair, some of it, braided and coiled and twisted into the shapes of leaves and small flowers, along with hair from her mother, who died 3 years ago, and a curl from her son, who did not survive his first winter. This is not morbid to Harriet. This is not even unusual to Harriet. Hair work, the craft of turning human hair into jewellery and wreaths and watch chains and mourning brooches, is a completely ordinary domestic skill in this decade, taught to girls the way needlepoint is taught, sold in instructional booklets, displayed proudly in the front room where visitors will see it. One more, and then we will slow down properly. In a rented house near Bath, a family is redecorating, and the paper they have chosen for the drawing room is a rich, vivid green, the fashionable shade of the moment, deep and saturated in a way that lamplight makes almost glow. It is called Shields green, and it gets that colour from copper arsenite. The family does not know this, not really, not in any way that changes their decision. Over the coming months, in damp weather, the wallpaper will release a faint, barely detectable gas, and members of the household will experience headaches, fatigue, and unexplained heaviness that the doctor, when called, will attribute to nerves, or the weather, or a weak constitution. Nobody will think to blame the wallpaper. Why would they? The wallpaper is beautiful. I tell you these 3 things first because I want you to feel, before we meet anyone properly, the particular texture of this century. It was not simpler than ours. It was not more innocent. It was, in 1,000 small domestic ways, quietly and cheerfully hazardous, dressed up in good manners and lovely fabric, and almost nobody living inside it thought there was anything odd about it at all. That is what tonight is for. Not the ballrooms, not the version you already know. The real texture underneath it, the small, strange, normal things, moving through one particular household, one particular woman, so you have somewhere to rest your attention as we go. Her name is Constance Ashby. She's 34 years old, and she lives in a tall brick house on a quiet street in North London. The kind of street with plane trees and a church at the end of it, and enough distance from the factories that the air is only somewhat dirty rather than genuinely foul. Her husband, Edmund, is a solicitor, successful enough for a cook and 2 housemaids, and a boy who comes in 3 mornings a week to clean boots and knives, not successful enough for a carriage of their own, which is a distinction Constance is aware of every single day, in ways too small and specific to easily explain to someone outside her world. They have 2 children, a girl of 9 and a boy of 6, both currently asleep upstairs under the supervision of a nursemaid named Ruth. It is just past 10 in the evening. Constance is sitting at her dressing table in a flannel wrapper, and her hair, down for the night, reaches nearly to her waist. In a moment we will follow her through this house properly, room by room, habit by habit. But I want to start here, at this small mirror, at this ordinary hour, because it is in these unremarkable minutes, the ones nobody thought worth recording, that the strangest details of this era tend to hide. Ruth, the nursemaid, is not brushing Constance's hair tonight. That task belongs to nobody in particular in this household, since they cannot afford a lady's maid proper, and so Constance does it herself, counting under her breath the way her own mother taught her, 100 strokes with a boar bristle brush, night after night, a habit so deeply worn into her that she sometimes finds herself counting in her sleep. The reasoning behind the 100 strokes is not vanity exactly, or not only vanity. It is believed, quite seriously, by nearly everyone in Constance's world, that regular brushing distributes the natural oils of the scalp along the length of the hair, strengthens the roots, and wards off the thinning that is considered one of the great quiet catastrophes that can befall a respectable woman as she ages. There are advertisements in the newspapers for tonics to prevent it. Tonics containing, more often than you would think, small quantities of alcohol and occasionally something stronger, sold without any of the regulation we would expect today. Constance does not use the tonics. She has heard whispers about a neighbour 2 streets over who did, and whose hair, if the gossip is to be believed, came out in clumps rather than growing back thicker as promised. Here is a detail I find myself turning over more than most. If Constance was slightly wealthier, if Edmund's practice had grown just a little further, she would very likely be wearing, right now, hair that is not entirely her own. Postiche, it was called. Added hair, woven or braided into a woman's natural hair, to create the thick coils and elaborate structures fashion demanded. And a great deal of that hair, sold by the pound in specialist shops, came from poor women in rural France and parts of Eastern Europe, who sold their own hair for money the way you might sell any other harvest. It travelled by the crate, sorted by colour and length, and ended up pinned into the heads of women in London and Paris and New York who never once thought about where it had come from. Constance has a small store of it herself, actually. A few false plaits kept in a drawer for special evenings, purchased 2 winters ago from a hairdresser on Oxford Street, who assured her, with total confidence, that it was of good English origin. She has no way of knowing whether that was true. Nobody really did. We should talk about the corset, because I think you already know the shape of that story, and I want to give you the part that usually gets left out. Yes, corsets were tight. Yes, some women, particularly the young, and particularly the fashionable, laced them tighter than any doctor would have advised, and there were real physical consequences to that: displaced organs, difficulty breathing deeply, a whole genre of Victorian fainting that was not always performance. But Constance, at 34, married 9 years, mother of 2, wears hers the way most women actually did, which is to say firmly, but not severely, more like a supportive garment than an instrument of torture, something that gave her posture and shape and, frankly, a place to store a handkerchief and a small pair of scissors when she needed her hands free. The scandalous tight lacing you have heard about was real, but it was the extreme edge of the practice, not its centre. The same way a handful of very online people today do not represent how most people actually use their phones. The ordinary version was less dramatic and considerably stranger in its own quiet way, simply because it was so completely unremarkable to everyone involved. And while we are speaking of things worn on the body, let me tell you about limbs. because this one still makes me smile a little every time I think about it. In Constance's social world, and in a great many households more genteel than hers, it was considered improper, verging on vulgar, to say the word leg. Not just about a person's leg, about furniture. A piano might be described as having limbs rather than legs. Some of the most fastidious households went so far as to drape little skirts around the legs of tables and pianos, so that the bare wooden limb would not be visible at all, sitting there in the drawing room in a state that polite society had collectively decided was a touch too suggestive for comfortable conversation. Constance finds this particular custom a little absurd herself, actually, and she has said so once or twice to Edmund quietly, after the children were in bed, which earned her a laugh and a warning to keep that opinion to herself at her sister-in-law's dinner table. Not every woman of her era found every rule sensible. That is worth remembering. They lived inside these customs, but living inside a thing and believing in it completely are not always the same. Let us step outside her bedroom for a moment, and into the wider rhythm of how a woman like Constance was expected to move through a room, because the etiquette of it was extraordinarily specific, more specific than most modern viewers would ever guess. A lady did not run, under any circumstance, in public. Not to catch an omnibus, not because it was raining, not for any reason at all, because running suggested a loss of composure, and a loss of composure suggested by a chain of associations that made complete sense within the logic of the era, a loss of moral control more broadly. A lady removed her gloves to eat and to write letters and for almost nothing else. Gloves stayed on to shake hands, gloves stayed on for calling, gloves stayed on in church, and bare hands in the wrong context could genuinely be read as a small social transgression, a hint of carelessness in a world where carelessness was assumed to travel from the hand straight to the character. The calling card system alone could occupy an entire evening of explanation, so I will give you the shape of it and let the rest sit with you. When a lady visited another lady's home and the lady of the house was not receiving visitors that day, or simply was not in, the visiting lady left a card, a small printed rectangle with her name on it, with the household servant at the door. But the card itself carried a language. A corner folded down in one particular way meant the visit was made in person rather than sent by a servant. A different fold meant condolence. A card left for the lady of the house, but intended to acknowledge the whole family might have a corner turned differently again, and everyone who received these cards understood the code instantly, the way you would understand a text message today, while a stranger to the system would have found the whole thing utterly opaque. Constance keeps a small silver tray on the hall table exactly for this purpose, and on a normal week, 6 or 8 cards might pass through it, each one a tiny transaction of status and obligation that had to be answered within a specific and unspoken window of time, usually within a matter of days, or the friendship itself was considered to have suffered a small, real injury. Let me take you downstairs now, because there is something in Constance's parlour that I think you will find genuinely strange, and it has been sitting there so long that nobody in the household notices it any more. On a shelf beside the window under a glass dome very much like the hair wreath we mentioned earlier, sits a small stuffed kitten, posed sitting upright with a tiny ribbon around its neck, forever mid-blink, forever exactly as it was on the day it died 6 years ago. This was Constance's cat before she married, a gift from her father, and when it died of old age she did what a great many households of her class did with a beloved pet, which was to send it to a taxidermist rather than bury it. Taxidermy was not the eccentric hobby you might assume it to be today. It was a booming, entirely respectable trade, with shops on ordinary high streets, and the parlours of the middle and upper middle class were often quietly full of small preserved creatures, birds under domes, the occasional favourite dog stretched out on a cushion forever, a squirrel posed holding an acorn on a little branch nailed to a base of painted plaster. Death, in this century, sat much closer to daily life than it does in ours, and the instinct to keep a beloved creature nearby rather than lower it into the ground was not seen as morbid at all, it was seen as tender. And speaking of death sitting close, I want to tell you about something else that lived in Constance's family album, tucked between pages of ordinary portraits, a photograph that would stop most modern viewers cold if they came across it without context. It is a photograph of Edmund's younger sister, taken when she was 4 years old, dressed in a white gown, eyes closed, arranged in a chair with a doll placed carefully in her lap. She had died of scarlet fever 3 days before the photograph was taken. Post-mortem photography, arranging and photographing the recently deceased, often as though sleeping, sometimes even propped to look awake, was an entirely ordinary practice in an era when photography itself was still new and often expensive, and a photograph taken after death might be the only image a family would ever possess of a child who did not live long enough to be photographed any other way. It is not a secret in this family, this photograph. It sits in the album without apology. Constance has shown it to visitors when the conversation turned that direction, the same way you might show someone a photograph of a wedding. Now, something a little lighter, before we move on, because I do not want tonight to sit too long in any one register. Let us talk about the boot boy, a young lad of about 12, who comes to the Ashby household 3 mornings a week before the family is properly awake, to clean and polish the family's boots and knives in a small room off the kitchen that smells permanently of blacking and metal polish. Boot blacking in this era is a genuinely unpleasant chemical business, made from a mixture that often included ingredients like bone char, vinegar, and various oils, applied by hand and buffed to a shine with brushes and rags, in a process that stains the fingers black for hours, no matter how carefully it is done. Knife cleaning is its own small operation, using a board coated in a fine abrasive paste to scrub away tarnish, a repetitive, monotonous task that occupies a good hour of the boy's morning before he is paid a few pence and sent on his way to whatever else fills his day. Households like the Ashbys did not think of this labour as remarkable in any way. It was simply Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, the same as it had been the week before and would be the week after. There is a particular kind of cleaning ritual too that happens twice a year in this house, and it has a name that has mostly vanished from modern vocabulary: spring cleaning, though the Ashby household does theirs in the early autumn as well. Every carpet is taken up and beaten outside on a line, every piece of furniture is moved and the walls behind it swept. And here is the detail that always catches people. Turpentine and other strong solvents are used liberally throughout the house to clean woodwork and remove the accumulated grime of coal smoke in a poorly ventilated home, by servants who have no particular protection from the fumes beyond an open window if the weather allows it. Coal smoke, in fact, is the quiet villain behind an enormous amount of Victorian domestic labour that we simply do not have an equivalent for today. Every surface in London homes of this era gathers a fine black soot within days, and an entire category of housework existed purely to fight a battle that could never actually be won, only managed, day after day, week after week. Let me shift you now towards something warmer, because I think you have earned a gentler subject for a few minutes. Courtship, in Constance's world, and in the world her own daughter will one day enter, was governed by a set of customs that moved at a pace almost unimaginable today, and I want to walk you through how it actually worked rather than the version you might have absorbed from novels. A young unmarried woman was almost never alone with a young man she was not related to, not for reasons of strict suspicion necessarily, but because the presence of a chaperone, usually an older relative or a trusted family friend, protected both parties from any question ever being raised about what had or had not occurred. Courtship therefore happened largely in public, or in rooms full of other people, conducted through conversation at dinners, through dances where a young man might be permitted 2 dances with the same young woman before eyebrows began to rise, through the careful semi-coded language of flowers, where a bouquet sent the day after a dance carried meaning entirely dependent on which blooms were included and in what arrangement. A sprig of ivy meant fidelity. Yellow roses, rather unkindly by today's standards, could suggest jealousy or even infidelity, which meant a young man sending flowers had to think quite carefully about his florist's inventory before he embarrassed himself entirely by accident. Constance remembers her own courtship with a kind of fondness that still surprises her a little, given how strange it looks now from the inside of a 9-year marriage. Edmund proposed to her in a letter, not in person, which was not unusual at all, since a written proposal gave a woman time to consider her answer without the pressure of a face watching her react. and gave a man the chance to say what he meant without stammering through it in front of witnesses. She kept that letter. It is in the same drawer as the false plaits of hair, folded into quarters, the ink slightly faded now, and she reads it perhaps once a year, usually on their anniversary, usually alone. There is a particular sentence in it about her laugh reminding him that the world was not only made of legal briefs and rain, that still, 9 years on, makes her chest go a little warm and a little sad at once, sad in the specific way that comes from remembering exactly who you were before you became who you are now. One more courtship custom before we move on, and this is one I genuinely love, in the way you can love something a little absurd. There is a persistent tradition, observed with real seriousness in some circles and treated as a bit of a joke in others, that during a leap year a woman is permitted to propose marriage to a man herself, reversing the usual order of things for one single day, the 29th of February. The custom carries a strange little penalty attached to it in most tellings, that a man who refuses such a proposal owes the woman a gift, traditionally a silk gown or a pair of gloves, as a kind of consolation for the trouble of asking. Constance's younger cousin Frances, 3 years ago on just such a leap day, apparently marched up to a young curate she had been quietly fond of for the better part of a year, and asked him outright, in front of 2 witnesses she had specifically arranged to have present, and the story, as it reached Constance second-hand through a letter, is that the poor young man went the colour of a boiled ham, and accepted on the spot, which the family still brings up at Christmas dinner with tremendous relish. Now let us talk about the body itself, because this is where the century gets, I think, its strangest and most well-meaning. Constance's youngest, the boy, had a cold last month, a bad one, feverish for 2 days, and the family doctor who called, a perfectly reputable and competent man by the standards of his time, prescribed a spoonful of a proprietary soothing syrup before bed to help him rest. What Constance does not fully appreciate, though she has heard whispers about it, is that syrups like this one, sold under names that sound almost cheerfully domestic, often contained real opium, sometimes in quantities that would alarm any modern parent, marketed specifically for restless infants and children, sold over the counter without prescription, advertised with images of peacefully sleeping babies on the label. Infant mortality tied to these syrups was a genuine, documented problem across the decade, though it moved through society quietly, blamed more often on the child's constitution than on the medicine everyone trusted. There is a broader belief running underneath nearly all Victorian medicine that I think explains a great deal of its strangeness, which is the conviction that night air itself was dangerous, actively unhealthy, something to be kept out of the sick room and, ideally, out of the bedroom altogether. Windows in Constance's household are shut firmly after dusk, regardless of the season, curtains drawn against whatever miasma the doctors of the era believed drifted through the darkness, carrying fever and consumption on currents nobody could see but everyone was certain existed. It would be several more decades before germ theory fully displaced this older thinking in the popular imagination, and in the meantime, entire households sealed themselves nightly against an enemy that was, ironically, mostly just fresh air. Bloodletting, by Constance's time, has become somewhat less common than it was for her grandmother's generation, but it has not disappeared, and leeches specifically remain a genuinely respected medical tool, kept alive in specially designed ceramic jars in some physicians' offices, applied to the skin near an area of inflammation or pain, in the belief that drawing blood would draw out the illness along with it. Constance herself underwent this once, as a girl of 16, for a bad headache that would not lift, 3 leeches applied behind her ear by a doctor her mother trusted completely, and she remembers, even now, the strange, almost ticklish sensation of it, and the faint dizziness afterward, that everyone assured her was the headache finally leaving her body rather than simple blood loss, which is, of course, exactly what it actually was. I want to end this particular stretch of odd medical belief with one that I find genuinely touching in its earnestness, which is the widespread conviction that a woman's nerves, her emotional temperament, her moods, her occasional restlessness or unhappiness were physical, medical conditions rooted quite literally in the womb, diagnosable under the broad and enormously overused label of hysteria. A woman like Constance, if she showed signs of prolonged low spirits, might be prescribed rest, quiet, an absence of intellectual stimulation, and in some more severe cases, treated with a device that a modern viewer would find almost impossible to reconcile with the buttoned-up propriety of the era, a mechanical massage apparatus used by physicians in a clinical, entirely unerotic context, understood at the time as legitimate medical treatment for a legitimate medical complaint. Constance has never undergone this particular treatment herself, but she knows a woman who has spoken of only very quietly, in the specific hushed tone reserved for subjects everyone understands but nobody names directly. Sunday in the Ashby household runs on a different set of rules entirely from the other 6 days, and I think it deserves its own moment here, because the strictness of it would surprise most modern viewers. The day begins with family prayers before breakfast, Edmund reading a short passage aloud while the children sit still, or attempt to, on the settee, and Constance follows along in her own worn prayer book. Church follows at 11, and it is not optional in any meaningful sense, not for illness short of genuine incapacitation, not for bad weather, not for simple tiredness. After church, the rest of the day is governed by a long, unspoken, but universally understood list of things one simply does not do on the Sabbath. No cards, no secular music, though hymns at the piano are perfectly acceptable, no needlework beyond the most essential mending, no letters written for pleasure, though letters of genuine necessity are tolerated. The children are not permitted their usual toys, and are instead given specifically religious books to occupy themselves with, illustrated stories of Bible figures and moral tales about disobedient children who come to various instructive bad ends. Constance finds Sundays, if she is honest with herself, a little long. She has said as much to nobody, not even Edmund, because even mild boredom with the Sabbath carries a faint whiff of impropriety that she would rather not have attached to her name. Underneath all of this sits a broader idea that shaped nearly every rule we have talked about tonight, the belief that women, specifically, were the moral guardians of the household, responsible not just for their own virtue, but for maintaining the entire family's standing in the unspoken ledger of respectability that every household in Constance's world was constantly, silently keeping on every other household. A woman's reputation was understood to be fragile in a way a man's was not, easily damaged by things that would barely register against a man's character, and once damaged, very difficult to fully repair. This is, I think, the quiet engine running underneath the glove rules, and the calling card codes, and the chaperones, and the strict Sunday observance. Every one of these small customs was, at bottom, a mechanism for protecting and demonstrating a kind of moral credit that a woman could spend her whole life building carefully and lose, in some unlucky circumstances, in a single careless afternoon, which brings us naturally to gossip, because a system built on watching and judging everyone's behavior produces, as you might expect, an enormous and constant undercurrent of talk. Constance has a small, tight circle of women she considers real friends, 4 or 5 of them, women she has known since before her marriage, or met through Edmund's professional connections, and when they gather, ostensibly for tea and needlework, a genuinely staggering amount of information changes hands. Who was seen walking with whom in the park, and whether a chaperone was actually present or merely claimed to be, whose husband has taken to coming home later than his business truly requires, whose daughter's engagement seems to have cooled rather suddenly, and what that might imply. This was not considered petty or beneath a respectable woman, not entirely. Gossip in Constance's world functioned as a genuine form of social currency and even social protection, a way that women, who had remarkably little formal power over anything, exercised real influence over reputation, over which families were considered suitable matches for which other families, over which small transgressions would be quietly forgiven and which would follow a person for years. Constance is, by her own private estimation, a fair participant in this economy, rather than a cruel one. She tries mostly to pass along kindness where she can, and hold her tongue where she cannot manage kindness, though she would be the first, in an honest mood, to admit she does not always succeed. We have moved through a great deal in a short space tonight: arsenic wafers and stuffed kittens and leap year proposals and leeches behind the ear, and I want to slow down properly now, because that was the wide, curious survey, the handful of strange, bright objects laid out on the table for you to look at. What I want to do for the rest of our time together is settle into one particular day inside this house, from the grey hour before dawn to the last candle going out at night, and let you simply live inside it with Constance at the pace she actually lived it, so that the strangeness we have already gathered has somewhere real to rest. It is not yet 5 in the morning when the first sounds begin in the Ashby house, and they do not come from Constance's floor at all. They come from below, from the kitchen, where the cook, a broad, capable woman named Mrs. Handley, who has worked for the family for 6 years, is coaxing the range back to life after a night of banked coals. This is a genuinely skilled task, not the simple business of striking a match you might imagine. A kitchen range in this era has to be raked out, its ash removed, fresh coal laid and shaped just so, and coaxed into an even heat that will need to last, carefully managed, through the preparation of every meal for the entire household for the whole day ahead. Mrs. Handley's hands, if you looked closely, carry the particular calloused roughness of a woman who has done this exact task, at this exact hour, for years without a single morning off except Christmas and the rare Sunday when illness makes it unavoidable. She works by a single candle for the first 20 minutes, since gas has not yet been lit in the kitchen, and the sound of the range catching, that low developing roar, is the true first sound of the household's day, before any human voice, before any door. Upstairs, in the small attic room she shares with the younger housemaid, a girl named Sarah is also awake, and her first task of the day, before she has so much as splashed water on her own face, is to descend 3 flights of stairs in the near dark, to begin laying and lighting fires in the rooms that will need them by the time the family rises. The breakfast room first, then Constance's bedroom, then, if there is time, the nursery. Fire laying is its own small craft, a particular arrangement of paper, kindling and coal, built up in layers so it catches quickly and burns evenly. And Sarah can do it, at 17, faster and more surely than Constance herself would be able to, even though Constance has technically been taught the theory of it as a girl. The way a woman of her class was taught the theory of most household tasks she would never actually be expected to perform herself. By the time Constance wakes, a little after 6:30, her room is already warm, the fire established and glowing, and there is a particular pleasure in this that she has never stopped noticing even after 9 years of marriage, waking into warmth that someone else created for her silently while she slept. She lies still for a few minutes, listening to the house settle into its morning rhythm below her, before ringing the small bell beside her bed for Sarah, who will bring up hot water for washing. There is a detail here I think is worth pausing on. The water Sarah carries up, in a heavy jug, has typically been heated twice already that morning, once for the kitchen's own washing needs and once specifically for the family, and carrying it up 3 flights of stairs without spilling a drop, twice a day at minimum, is a physical labour that would leave most modern people's arms aching within a week. Sarah does it without apparent strain, has done it for 2 years, and will likely go on doing it for several more, until she marries or finds a position with somewhat easier duties, whichever comes first. Breakfast in the Ashby household is served at 8, and here is a small custom I find genuinely charming in its specificity. The newspaper, delivered before dawn and still faintly damp with the ink not yet fully dry, is ironed by Sarah before it reaches the breakfast table, pressed flat with a heated flat iron in a swift, practiced motion. The stated reason, and the one everyone in the household would give you without hesitation, is hygiene, a belief that ironing helped dry any remaining dampness and possibly killed whatever unseen contagion might theoretically be riding along in the fresh ink or the delivery boy's hands. The more likely actual benefit, though nobody articulates it this way, is simply that ironing keeps the pages from curling and smudging, which lets Edmund read his paper at the table without black ink transferring to his fingers and, from there, potentially to his cuffs, which would be a small but real domestic catastrophe given how much laundering a stained cuff would require. Constance has never questioned this ritual. It has simply always been done, the way the sun has simply always come up. Breakfast itself is a substantial meal by our standards. Eggs and bacon and toast and a pot of tea strong enough that a spoon could very nearly stand up in it. And there is a strict wordless etiquette even here, at the family's own table with no guests present. Edmund reads his paper. Constance does not read hers, not because she is forbidden exactly, but because a lady reading at breakfast, even the family breakfast, carries a faint suggestion of neglecting the conversational and domestic attentiveness that is quietly expected of her at all times, in all rooms, regardless of who is present to notice. She talks instead, softly, with the children, who eat at the same table this morning since it is a schoolroom holiday, correcting their elbows, asking about their planned activities, listening with half her attention while the other half runs, as it does most mornings, through the day's obligations, laid out in her mind like a general reviewing a map. Today there are 3 things on that mental map that matter more than the rest. She is due to receive callers between 2 and 4 this afternoon, which means the drawing room must be properly arranged, and a small selection of cake and sherry kept ready in case anyone stays past the strictly polite 15 minutes. She has promised to call on her friend Louisa, whose mother-in-law has been unwell, a visit of comfort and duty combined, the particular Victorian genre of social obligation that manages to be both genuinely kind and quietly mandatory at once. And this evening she and Edmund are hosting 6 guests for dinner, a dinner that has occupied a meaningful portion of Constance's attention for the better part of a week already, in ways we will get to properly once the afternoon calls are behind us. There is one more thing on Constance's private mental map today, though it is not the kind of thing that would ever appear on Edmund's list, or on anyone's list but her own. Kept in a place so private, she has never once spoken it aloud to another living soul, not even Louisa, whom she trusts with nearly everything else. Twice a month, on a schedule only she knows, Constance writes, not letters, not household accounts, but something closer to essays, short pieces of observation and opinion on subjects that would raise more than one eyebrow at her own dinner table tonight if anyone knew their true author, subjects like the education of girls, or the strange legal position of a married woman's property, which technically, under the law as it currently stands, belongs entirely to her husband the moment she says her vows. She sends these pieces, under a man's initials, to a small periodical that publishes them without any idea that the author folding linen and pouring tea in North London is the same person whose arguments occasionally provoke a testy response in the letters column the following month. It began 3 years ago, almost by accident, a single letter to the editor that she never expected to see printed. It has become, quietly, one of the truest parts of her, a small locked room inside an otherwise entirely visible life, and she guards it as carefully as she guards anything, because she suspects, without ever quite letting herself finish the thought, that Edmund, decent as he is, dear as he is, would not entirely know what to do with a wife whose mind reached quite this far past the edges of the role she plays so well. By 1:30, Constance has changed into what her wardrobe quietly categorizes as an afternoon dress, distinct from the morning dress she wore at breakfast, and entirely distinct from the evening dress waiting, brushed and ready, on its form upstairs for tonight's dinner. This distinction, 3 separate categories of dress for 3 separate portions of a single ordinary day, is not something Constance thinks of as excessive. It is simply the shape her life takes, the same way you might not think twice about changing from pajamas to daytime clothes to something nicer for an evening out, except that her version involves considerably more fabric, considerably more assistance, and considerably more social meaning attached to getting it wrong. Wearing a morning dress to receive afternoon callers would not go unnoticed. It would be read, correctly, as either an oversight or a small, deliberate signal that the visit was not being taken entirely seriously, and Constance has no wish to send that signal to anyone, least of all to the 2 women who arrive at her door promptly at 2 o'clock. The drawing room, by the time they arrive, has been arranged with the particular staged casualness that these visits require. Cake sliced and covered on the sideboard, sherry decanted, the good china set out rather than the everyday set, and Constance herself seated in a chair positioned to receive rather than lounging on the settee, because a lady at home to callers is understood to be, in some sense, always slightly on display, always slightly performing a version of ease that takes real effort to maintain. The first caller is a Mrs. Whitmore, a woman perhaps 10 years older than Constance, whose husband sits on the same church committee as Edmund, and whose visit today Constance suspects correctly within about 90 seconds of her arrival has less to do with friendship and more to do with quietly assessing whether the Ashbys would be suitable company for a larger dinner Mrs. Whitmore is planning in the spring. This kind of visit, evaluative underneath its warm surface, is common enough that Constance has developed a genuine skill for it, a way of being pleasant and forthcoming without revealing anything that might later be used, even innocently, to her disadvantage. The strict rule governing a call like this one is 15 minutes, no more, and Constance keeps loose track of the time without ever once glancing obviously at the small clock on the mantel, a skill that took her years of practice to develop and that she now performs so smoothly it looks like nothing at all. A caller who overstays this window, lingering past a quarter of an hour without a clear invitation from the hostess to remain longer, risks being quietly judged as either poorly bred or, worse, socially desperate, clinging to a visit past its natural close because she has nowhere better to be and no one better to see. Mrs. Whitmore, to her credit, rises at almost exactly the 14-minute mark, and the two women part with warm words and a promise, only partly sincere on either side, to see each other again soon. The second caller of the afternoon is genuinely welcome, in a way the first was not. A young woman named Cecilia, who married into the neighbourhood only last year, and who Constance has taken something of a liking to, partly because Cecilia has a quick, slightly irreverent sense of humour that reminds Constance faintly of herself at that age, before 9 years of careful performance smoothed some of the edges off. Cecilia stays closer to 25 minutes, which is permitted, even expected, when a genuine friendship rather than a formal obligation is being maintained, and the two of them talk, among other things, about a novel currently being serialized in one of the popular magazines, a scandalous story of a woman trapped in an unhappy marriage that half of London seems to be reading in installments and discussing in exactly the hushed, faintly thrilled tones the two of them use now. Neither of them says aloud what both of them are perhaps quietly thinking, that the story's power comes precisely from how recognizable its unhappiness is, dressed up as fiction so that it can be discussed at all. After Cecilia leaves, Constance has perhaps 40 minutes before she needs to set out for Louisa's, and she uses them to sit alone in the now quiet drawing room, the sherry put away, the extra cake covered again for tomorrow, and to think, briefly and privately, about the piece she is working on for the periodical, an argument about whether a girl's education ought to include anything beyond music, drawing, and enough arithmetic to manage household accounts. She has half a page of notes hidden inside the lining of her writing case, in a small pocket she sewed there herself 2 years ago specifically for this purpose, and she does not take them out now, there is not time, but she thinks through a sentence or two anyway, turning phrases over the way another woman might turn over a piece of embroidery, testing how they sit. The walk to Louisa's takes just under 20 minutes, and Constance makes it on foot, accompanied by Sarah, since an unmarried woman, or even a married one of Constance's standing, does not generally walk any distance through London streets entirely alone, not out of any specific fear so much as a general social expectation that a lady is accompanied. The same expectation that puts a chaperone at every dance and a companion in every carriage. The streets themselves are worth a moment of your attention here, because London in this decade is a genuinely overwhelming sensory experience in ways that do not always survive into the tidy version we picture from photographs. The air carries coal smoke thick enough to occasionally catch in the throat, and underneath it, threaded through every street regardless of how respectable the neighbourhood, the smell of horse manure specifically, because every cart, every omnibus, every private carriage runs on horses whose waste is a constant, unglamorous fact of urban life that an army of crossing sweepers, mostly young boys, work to clear from the paths that ladies like Constance actually intend to walk across, in exchange for whatever small coin a grateful pedestrian might offer. Louisa receives her warmly despite the strain visible in her face, the particular tiredness of a household managing a long illness, and the two of them sit together for the better part of an hour, Constance offering the specific, practiced comfort of a woman who has done this exact kind of visit many times before, listening more than speaking, asking practical questions about whether the doctor has been by recently, and whether the nursing arrangements are holding up, and only near the end allowing the conversation to drift somewhere more personal, where Louisa admits, in a voice pitched low enough that even her own servants would not hear it through the door, that she is frightened, genuinely frightened, that her mother-in-law will not recover this time, and that she does not entirely know how to grieve a woman she has spent 11 years finding, if she is honest, rather difficult to love. Constance takes her hand at this, gloves both still on, and says nothing clever, nothing wise, just stays, which is, she has come to believe over the years, most of what real comfort actually consists of. Constance returns home a little after 4 to find the children in the nursery with Ruth, and she spends a quiet half-hour there before the demands of the evening properly begin, which is, if she is honest, one of the genuinely good parts of her day rather than one of its obligations. The nursery itself operates on its own set of rules, largely separate from the formal etiquette governing the rest of the house, though not entirely free of the era's particular ideas about how children ought to be raised. Her daughter, at 9, still occasionally wears what are called leading strings when out walking in crowded places, long fabric straps sewn into the shoulders of her coat that a nursemaid or parent can hold, functionally identical in purpose to what you would recognize instantly as a toddler harness, except that leading strings were used on children well into the age we would now consider old enough for a firm hand to suffice, a holdover from an era of even stricter physical control over children that is only just beginning to loosen by Constance's time. Discipline in the nursery is firmer than most modern parents would find comfortable to watch, though gentler, in the Ashby household specifically, than in a great many others of the era. Ruth does not raise a hand to the children, a fact Constance insisted on when Ruth was first hired, having decided, somewhat unusually for her class and generation, that she did not want physical punishment used on her own children, even though she herself received it occasionally as a girl. This was, in its own small way, a quietly progressive stance, not universal, not even common, but not unheard of either, among a certain kind of thoughtful parent beginning to question inherited practices simply because they had once been on the receiving end of them and remembered, more clearly than they expected to as adults, exactly how it felt. What does happen in the nursery, regularly and without any sense that it is unusual, is a fairly strict schedule of naps, meals and quiet occupation that leaves remarkably little room for the kind of unstructured play a modern child might take for granted. Constance's son, at 6, is expected to sit still through a full hour of quiet reading or simple lessons in the middle of the afternoon, considered essential for developing the self-discipline that will serve him well at school in a few years' time, and while he fidgets through most of it the way any 6-year-old would, the household's expectation that he learn to master that fidgeting rather than simply express it is treated as a basic, uncontroversial part of raising him properly. Constance watches him today, curled awkwardly over a picture book he is only partly interested in, and feels the small, complicated tenderness of a parent who both wants her child disciplined enough to succeed in the world he is entering, and quietly wishes, in some private corner of herself she rarely examines too closely, that the world required a little less discipline of small children than it currently does. At 5:30, Constance goes up to dress for the evening, and this is where the day's labour, for her personally, reaches its most demanding point, because tonight is not simply dinner with Edmund, it is a dinner party for 6 guests, and everything about the next several hours has been planned, in some cases for over a week, with a precision that would not embarrass a military campaign. The dress waiting on its form is a deep plum silk, cut lower at the neckline than her daytime dresses, and considerably more structured through the bodice, and getting into it properly requires nearly 40 minutes with Sarah's help, lacing, hooking, arranging, before Constance even sits down at the mirror for her hair to be redone from the simpler daytime style into something more elaborate, a series of coils and small curls pinned with combs that belong to her own mother. The seating arrangement for tonight's table has occupied more of Constance's actual thinking over the past week than almost anything else about the evening, because in a formal Victorian dinner, who sits where is not a casual decision, but a precise reflection of rank, and getting it wrong is the kind of social error that guests remember for years. The most senior gentleman present, by title or professional standing, escorts the hostess into dinner and sits at her right hand. The most senior lady present is escorted by the host and sits at his right hand. Every other guest is placed according to a similar, carefully considered calculus of age, marital status and social standing, and Constance has, over the course of the week, redrawn her seating chart on a small card no fewer than 4 times, once because she realized she had seated 2 guests beside each other who were known to hold sharply opposing views on a recent piece of parliamentary legislation, and did not fancy refereeing that particular argument over the fish course. Guests begin arriving a little after 7, and the ritual of arrival itself carries its own small precision. Coats and hats handed to the parlour maid at the door, gentlemen and ladies separated briefly into different rooms to freshen themselves before being brought together in the drawing room for a period of conversation that will last perhaps 20 minutes before dinner is formally announced. This waiting period is not idle time. It is, in its own quiet way, the true beginning of the evening's performance, the moment when Constance moves from guest to guest, ensuring conversation flows, that no one is left standing alone for longer than a minute or two, that the 2 guests with opposing parliamentary views, now safely seated apart at dinner, are also kept at a comfortable conversational distance from each other here in the drawing room as well. When the butler, borrowed for the evening from a neighbouring household since the Ashbys do not keep one permanently, announces that dinner is served, the procession into the dining room follows its strict order, gentleman offering his arm to the lady he has been assigned to escort, moving in careful sequence of rank, Edmund leading with the most senior lady present, Constance following on the arm of the most senior gentleman, and every other pair falling in behind according to the same calculus that determined the seating chart in the first place. It is, I think, worth pausing to notice how much invisible mathematics underlies 20 seconds of guests simply walking from one room to another. Nobody at the table tonight will consciously register the choreography. They will simply feel, without being able to say exactly why, that the evening is being handled by a competent and thoughtful hostess, which is, of course, precisely the intended effect. The meal itself runs to a full 7 courses, which was entirely ordinary for a formal dinner of this kind. Soup, fish, a remove of some substantial meat, an entree, a sweet course, cheese, and finally a dessert of fruit and small confections, each course accompanied by its own appropriate wine, poured and cleared with a rhythm the borrowed butler manages smoothly enough that Constance only notices his slight unfamiliarity with the house twice all evening, both times minor enough that she doubts any of her guests caught it at all. There is a particular rule governing conversation at a table like this one that I find genuinely interesting, which is that a lady is expected to divide her attention evenly between the gentlemen seated on either side of her, turning first to one for a portion of the meal and then to the other, never allowing herself to become absorbed in conversation with only one dinner partner for the whole evening, a small social choreography designed to keep the table's energy distributed and to prevent exactly the kind of prolonged, exclusive attention between a married woman and a man not her husband that could, however innocently intended, become the subject of exactly the gossip Constance and her friends traded so freely over tea earlier this same week. Certain topics are understood, without anyone needing to say so aloud, to be unsuitable for the dinner table, particularly one mixing gentlemen and ladies together. Illness in any graphic detail, anything touching too directly on money, one's own or anyone else's, religious controversy, as opposed to religion in its safely general and agreeable form, and, with particular firmness, anything touching on the more intimate workings of the body, a category broad enough that Constance once watched an entire dinner table go politely, briefly silent when a young and not yet fully socialized guest made an offhand reference to being unwell that skirted slightly too close to specifics that belonged, by unspoken consensus, firmly in the private sphere. Tonight, thankfully, the conversation stays safely within its expected banks, moving between a recent exhibition at the Royal Academy, a debate about the merits of a new railway line being proposed nearby, and, inevitably, the same serialized novel Constance discussed with Cecilia that afternoon, which seems to have colonized every drawing room in London this particular month. When the meal concludes, the evening performs one of its most distinctive rituals, the separation of the sexes, ladies withdrawing to the drawing room while the gentlemen remain at the table for port, cigars, and conversation understood to be unsuitable or simply uninteresting for mixed company. This separation is not a small aside in the evening, it is a structurally important moment, a formally sanctioned space in which men could discuss business, politics, and whatever else they pleased without the moderating presence of women, and in which women, correspondingly, gathered in the drawing room for a stretch of conversation entirely their own, often, if Constance's experience is any guide, considerably franker and more interesting than anything that happened at the table itself, once the performance for mixed company had been set aside for 20 or 30 minutes. Tonight, in the drawing room, freed from the table's careful choreography, the ladies present talk more openly than they have all evening, one of them confiding, in the specific hushed register reserved for real disclosures, that her husband's business has taken a worrying turn that she has not yet found the nerve to discuss with her own mother, and Constance finds herself, not for the first time, struck by how much of the genuine emotional life of women in her world happens in exactly these interstitial moments, the 20 minutes after dinner, the hour after church, the half hour before a caller's 15 minutes properly begin, small unofficial pockets of time carved out of a day otherwise entirely governed by performance and obligation. The gentlemen rejoin the ladies a little before 10, smelling faintly of cigar smoke that no amount of careful ventilation ever quite manages to keep out of the curtains, and the evening moves into its final, more relaxed stretch. Music at the piano, a little conversation, the particular loosening that happens once the formal architecture of the meal itself has been dismantled and put away. Constance's own younger sister-in-law, visiting for the season and staying 2 streets over, plays a piece by Mendelssohn competently if not brilliantly, and there is a small, warm ritual of polite praise afterward that everyone present understands is partly sincere and partly simply what one says, the two things not actually in conflict the way you might assume, because sincerity and convention were never quite as opposed in this world as they can feel from the outside. One of the gentlemen present tonight, a Mr. Hargreave, mentions in passing that he recently returned from a fortnight at a spa town, one of the fashionable inland resorts built around a natural mineral spring, and the conversation drifts, for a few minutes, into the particular and genuinely odd rituals of Victorian health tourism. Drinking the water at these places was treated with an almost medical solemnity, guests rising early to walk to the pump room and drink several glasses of mineral water that by most contemporary accounts tasted distinctly of rotten eggs or rusted iron depending on the specific spring, taken not for pleasure but as a course of treatment, prescribed in specific quantities at specific times of day, the way a modern doctor might prescribe a medication. Bathing in the same waters, often kept at a carefully regulated temperature in elaborate indoor bathing halls, was believed to treat everything from rheumatism to nervous complaints to complaints of the skin, and an entire seasonal economy of hotels, assembly rooms, and promenades grew up around towns whose entire civic identity rested on a spring that, by modern medical understanding, likely did very little beyond providing a pleasant, restful holiday and the placebo benefit of believing sincerely that one was being cured. Mr. Hargreave also mentions, with the particular relish of a man who has told this story before and knows it lands well, the bathing machines he encountered at the coastal town he visited on the same trip, and this is one of those Victorian inventions that I think genuinely deserves a moment of your attention, because it is stranger than almost anything else we have talked about tonight. A bathing machine was a small wooden hut on large wheels, and a lady wishing to swim would enter it fully dressed, on the beach, while a horse or in some cases a team of men pulled the entire hut down into the shallow water, allowing her to change into her bathing costume inside, in complete privacy, and then descend directly into the sea via steps at the back of the machine, without ever once being visible on the open beach in a state of undress, or even in her bathing costume itself, walking across sand where a gentleman might happen to glance her way. Some resorts maintained entirely separate stretches of beach for men and women specifically, so that even the sight of mixed bathing, fully clothed in bathing costumes that by modern standards covered nearly the entire body anyway, would not occur. The amount of engineering, economic investment, and sheer collective social effort required to prevent the sight of a woman's ankle in seawater tells you, I think, almost everything you need to know about how seriously this century took the management of a woman's visibility. Talk turns briefly, as it often does in November, to Christmas, still 6 weeks off but already beginning to occupy a portion of every household's planning. And there is a detail here worth mentioning, which is how genuinely recent much of what we now consider traditional Christmas actually was to Constance's generation. The Christmas tree, decorated and lit with real candles in the German fashion, had only become widely fashionable in English homes within living memory, popularized substantially by the royal family, and Constance can still remember her own grandmother regarding the whole custom when it first appeared as a slightly foreign novelty rather than the deeply rooted tradition it would become for her own grandchildren. Christmas cards too, printed and exchanged the way we still do now, were a genuinely new commercial product, only a few decades old, and Constance has a small stack already prepared in a drawer upstairs, chosen this year from a selection at a stationer's on the high street, each one to be written with a short personal line before being sent out in the first week of December. Around 11 the evening begins, gently and without anyone announcing it directly, to wind down, the first guests rising with the particular unhurried courtesy of people who know precisely how long is polite to stay and precisely how to leave without seeming either too eager or too reluctant. Constance stands at the door as each pair departs, thanking them with warmth that is, by this point in the evening, only about half performance, genuinely tired now in the specific way that comes from hours of sustained attentiveness rather than physical exertion, and it is nearly midnight before the last guests have gone, the borrowed butler paid and dismissed, and the house left to Constance, Edmund, and the servants who will spend the next hour clearing the dining room before they too are finally permitted to rest. Before I take you upstairs with Constance for the last quiet part of the night, I want to slow down and tell you about mourning, because it is one of the areas of Victorian life where the rules were most elaborate, most rigidly enforced, and, I think, most genuinely strange to a modern ear, and Constance's own household is at this very moment still technically observing a version of it. Edmund's mother died 14 months ago, and though the deepest phase of formal mourning has passed, certain smaller observances linger still, threaded quietly through the household in ways a visitor might not immediately notice, but that govern Constance's choices every single day. A widow, under the fullest and strictest interpretation of the era's mourning code, was expected to wear black, and specifically a dull, matte black fabric without any sheen or ornament, for a full year and a day following her husband's death, a period called deep mourning, during which she was expected to withdraw substantially from social life, attend no balls, no theatre, no parties of any real gaiety, and limit her jewellery to mourning pieces made specifically for the purpose, often incorporating jet, a black polishable stone, or the woven hair of the deceased set into a brooch or ring. After this first year, a widow moved into what was called second mourning, during which small amounts of trim in white, grey or mauve might be introduced, and finally into half mourning, a transitional period lasting several months more, in which soft purples and greys were gradually permitted before a woman could, at last, return fully to ordinary colours. The entire progression, from deepest black to full colour, could stretch across 2 full years or longer for a widow, and while the rules were somewhat less severe for a woman mourning a parent, a child or an in-law, they still governed dress, social attendance, and even correspondence, since stationery itself, during a period of mourning, was typically bordered in black, the width of the border actually decreasing over time as the period of deepest grief gradually lifted. A visual, measurable timeline of sorrow printed right onto the corner of every letter a household sent. Constance, technically still in the outer edge of this observance for her mother-in-law, still keeps a small drawer of black-bordered stationery, though the border on what remains is now quite narrow, and she still avoids, without needing to think about it much anymore, wearing anything too bright or too celebratory to occasions where Edmund's side of the family will be present. A small daily discipline of restraint that has become so habitual over the past year that she barely registers it as restraint at all. There is a particular etiquette manual on the shelf in the drawing room, well thumbed, that Constance consulted extensively when Edmund's mother first died, uncertain exactly how deep her own personal grief for a woman she had liked well enough but not loved deeply ought to be performed publicly, since the code, strict as it was, still required a woman to calibrate the visible depth of her mourning to to match her actual relationship to the deceased. Too little mourning read as coldness, too much for a merely liked mother-in-law could read as a strange, almost suspicious excess. I mentioned crinolines earlier only briefly, and I want to give them a proper moment now, because the structure itself, the wide, bell-shaped cage of steel hoops worn under a skirt to create the enormous, fashionable silhouette of earlier decades, carried a genuine, well-documented physical hazard that seems almost unbelievable from a modern vantage point. Crinolines caught fire, regularly, a woman standing too close to an open grate or a candle, her enormous skirt swinging even slightly in the draught of a doorway, could find the fabric catching in an instant, and because the cage structure held the burning fabric away from her body, rather than allowing her to smother the flame quickly against herself, crinoline fires spread with a speed that killed a genuinely significant number of women across the decades the fashion was popular, well documented enough that newspapers periodically ran safety notices and satirical cartoons both, treating the danger with a strange mixture of real concern and dark, characteristically Victorian humour. By Constance's time, the crinoline proper has fallen out of fashion, replaced by the bustle, a structure that pushes volume to the back of the skirt rather than spreading it in a full circle. But she remembers her own mother's crinoline days, and remembers too being warned as a girl, quite seriously, to stay well clear of the fireplace whenever she wore the smaller version fashionable for children at the time. There is a kind of Victorian custom I have always found quietly delightful in its pettiness, and I think tonight is the right time to tell you about it, because it sits so strangely against the polite, restrained world we have spent the last hour inside. Valentine's Day in this era was not universally sentimental the way we think of it now. Alongside the lace-bordered cards and pressed flowers and carefully chosen verses, there existed an entire, genuinely popular category of what were called vinegar valentines, cheaply printed cards sold openly in shops beside their romantic counterparts, designed specifically to insult the recipient. A vinegar valentine might mock a man for his baldness, a woman for her sharp tongue, or her failure to secure a husband by a certain age, a shopkeeper for dishonest dealing, and they were sent, often anonymously, through the ordinary post, arriving on a doorstep alongside the genuine declarations of love that same February morning, so that a household's post on Valentine's Day could contain both a sincere proposal and a cruel little cartoon calling someone an old maid, with no way to know which was coming until the envelope was opened. Constance herself received one, years ago, as a girl of 19, a nasty little rhyme about her nose that she still, if she is honest, remembers more clearly than any of the kind ones she received that same season, which perhaps tells you something true about how memory works regardless of century. Phrenology, too, deserves a mention, because Constance's own father was, for a period in her childhood, quite genuinely convinced by it. A pseudoscience that held the shape and bumps of a person's skull revealed real information about their character, their intelligence, their moral tendencies, mapped onto specific regions of the head with the confident precision of a genuine science, complete with diagrams, professional practitioners who would run their hands over a client's skull and deliver a detailed character reading, and popular books explaining which bump indicated benevolence and which indicated a tendency toward destructiveness. It sat, in the popular imagination of the era, somewhere between genuine science and parlor entertainment, taken with real seriousness by educated people who would have been insulted to be called credulous, and largely, quietly abandoned by the time Constance reached adulthood, though she still remembers, with a mixture of fondness and mild embarrassment, her father solemnly informing a dinner guest once that the shape of the man's forehead suggested a strong capacity for mathematics, based on absolutely nothing that would hold up to any scrutiny at all, though nobody at that table thought to challenge him on it. Let me tell you something about teeth, briefly, because it is the kind of small physical detail that tends to stick with people once they hear it. Dental care in this era, even among households as comfortable as the Ashbys, remained genuinely rudimentary by modern standards, and tooth loss, even among the relatively young, was common enough that it did not carry quite the same social alarm it might today. A full set of false teeth, when needed, might be carved from ivory, or in a detail that tends to make modern listeners sit up a little. Occasionally fashioned from teeth pulled from the dead, harvested from battlefields in an earlier generation, or purchased from the poor, who might sell their own healthy teeth for a much-needed sum of money, to be transplanted or simply worn as dentures by a wealthier buyer entirely unbothered by their origin. Constance, thankfully, has all her own teeth still, cared for with a chalk and salt-based tooth powder applied with a small brush. But she is aware, in the specific matter-of-fact way people are aware of the ordinary risks of their own era, that this is not something she can take entirely for granted as she grows older. Downstairs, even now, past midnight, the household is not quite finished with its day. Sarah and the parlour maid are clearing the last of the dining room, carrying the good china down to be washed before morning, rather than left to sit, since a stain set overnight on fine porcelain was considered a real domestic sin, and Mrs. Handley, though her own work is done for the day, has left the kitchen banked and ready for the early morning fire that will need lighting again in barely 5 hours. The servant hierarchy in a household like this one, modest by the standards of the truly wealthy but still substantial by ours, runs its own quiet internal order, the cook outranking the housemaids observing careful distinctions of seniority between themselves, all of it invisible to the family upstairs but keenly, constantly felt by everyone living it from below. Sarah, at 17, is near the bottom of this small internal ladder, and she has confided to Mrs. Handley, though never to Constance directly, that she hopes within a few years to advance to the position of a proper lady's maid in a grander household, work that carries more status, better pay, and, above all, considerably less time spent hauling water up 3 flights of stairs before the sun has properly risen. Constance climbs the stairs a little after midnight, Edmund already ahead of her, and before she reaches her own room she pauses, as she nearly always does, at the small writing desk on the landing where the household keeps its correspondence supplies, to check whether anything needs answering before tomorrow. Letter writing occupied a genuinely enormous portion of a woman's ordinary week in this era, in a way that is difficult to fully convey to anyone who has grown up with a telephone in easy reach. A missed letter, a delayed reply, a note that should have been sent within 2 or 3 days of an event and was not, carried real social weight, the same weight, roughly, as an unanswered message might carry today, except stretched across a system that depended entirely on the reliability of the post, which was, to be fair to Constance's era, remarkably efficient, with multiple deliveries a day in London, meaning a letter posted in the morning might genuinely receive a reply by evening. There is a particular habit of letter writing from an earlier generation that Constance's own grandmother still practiced, and that Constance finds herself faintly nostalgic for, called crossed writing or cross-hatching, in which a letter writer, having filled a page with horizontal lines of text, would turn the paper 90 degrees and write a second layer of text directly across the first, creating a dense cross-hatched grid of ink that somehow, with sufficient practice reading it, remained legible, all done specifically to save on the cost of paper and postage in an earlier era when sending an additional sheet meant a genuinely significant additional expense. By Constance's time, the introduction of the penny post decades earlier has made sending letters considerably cheaper and more democratic than it once was, a flat rate regardless of distance that transformed correspondence from a costly formality, mostly reserved for the wealthy, into something close to a universal habit, and Constance, unlike her grandmother, no longer needs to crowd 2 letters worth of thought onto a single expensive page. Standing at that desk tonight, past midnight, in a house finally gone properly quiet, Constance allows herself, for perhaps 20 minutes, the thing she has been quietly looking forward to since breakfast without ever letting the thought surface too clearly during the day itself. She takes out a small plain notebook kept behind a false panel at the back of the desk drawer, a compartment Edmund does not know exists, and she writes, by the light of a single candle rather than the gas lamp that would carry too clearly under the door, a few paragraphs continuing the piece on girls' education that has been forming in her mind, on and off, since her walk to Louisa's this afternoon. Her handwriting here is faster, looser, less careful than the handwriting she uses for the calling cards and thank you notes that occupy most of her daylight correspondence, and there is something in that difference, I think, worth sitting with for a moment. The version of Constance's handwriting that the world sees, the neat, careful, socially appropriate hand, is not quite the same handwriting she uses when she is writing only for herself or for the small, anonymous audience of strangers reading a periodical column under a man's initials, never knowing that the mind behind those initials spent the afternoon deciding on cake for callers and the seating chart for a dinner party 6 people would forget the particulars of within a month. She thinks, tonight, briefly, about a moment 2 years ago that still sits uneasily whenever she remembers it. A moment when Edmund, sorting through some household correspondence at this very desk, came within what felt like inches of finding the notebook, his hand actually resting on the drawer's edge for a moment while he searched for a misplaced bill, before he was called away by one of the children, and the moment simply passed, unremarkable to him, remembered by Constance ever since with the particular vividness of a near miss. She has never decided in the 2 years since whether she would tell him if the notebook were ever found, whether he would be hurt or proud or simply baffled, and she has come to suspect, in her more honest moments, that the not knowing is part of why she has never simply told him herself and settled the question. Some rooms, she has decided, are allowed to stay locked even inside an otherwise happy marriage. This is one of hers. Let me pull back from Constance for just a moment, because I want to tell you something about the wider world she is quietly participating in every time she seals one of those anonymous columns into an envelope. She is far from the only woman of her era doing something like this. Periodicals across the decade regularly published essays, opinion pieces, and even entire novels under initials, pseudonyms, or simply the label a lady, precisely because a woman's authorship, if publicly known, could affect how seriously her ideas were taken, or worse, could reflect badly on her husband's standing, on the theory that a wife with public opinions reflected a household not quite properly ordered. Some of the era's most significant writers worked this way for years before their true identities became known, and countless others, women like Constance, never became known at all, their words read and argued over by thousands of strangers who never once suspected the author was pouring tea and managing a seating chart the very same afternoon she finished the sentence they found so persuasive. I want to take you back further than tonight for a moment, back 17 years, to a ballroom Constance remembers with a clarity that still slightly surprises her, because most of her memories from that particular winter have gone soft and general with time, the way memories do, except this one, which has stayed sharp. She was 17, in her first proper season, the elaborate, exhausting annual ritual through which young women of a certain class were formally introduced to society, with the specific, unhidden goal of securing a suitable marriage within a small handful of years before the window began, quietly but definitely, to close. A season meant a punishing schedule of balls, dinners, garden parties and calls, sometimes several events in a single evening, each one an opportunity for a young woman to be seen, assessed, and ideally noticed by a young man whose family would be considered a suitable match by both sides. The ball Constance remembers so clearly was her third of that season, and she recalls with a specificity that makes her smile faintly even now at her writing desk, the small ivory dance card hanging from a ribbon at her wrist, a booklet barely larger than her palm with a tiny attached pencil in which the names of the gentlemen she danced with, in order, were recorded as the evening progressed. A young woman's dance card, filled or half empty by the end of an evening, was a small, visible, entirely public record of her social success that night, and Constance remembers the particular anxiety of the first hour of any ball, waiting to see whether her card would fill, before the relief, later, of looking down at 7 names in a hand not her own, evidence that the evening had gone well. She remembers, too, that a young lady was strictly limited in how many dances she could accept from any single gentleman before the numbers themselves began to constitute a kind of public announcement. 2 dances, suggesting interest, 3 edging into something that would have the chaperones exchanging glances across the room, and a 4th being, by the unwritten but universally understood rules of the era, something close to a declaration that could not easily be walked back afterward. Edmund, that night, was her 4th partner and, though neither of them knew it yet, would go on to become her 5th, 6th and 7th as well, a breach of the informal rule serious enough that Constance remembers her own mother's hand finding her elbow rather firmly during the interval between the 6th and 7th dance. A silent, unmistakable signal that whatever was happening on that dance floor had gone well past the point of casual interest and needed, at minimum, to be acknowledged properly by both families. before it continued any further in public. It did continue, of course, though rather more discreetly for the rest of that season. Walks in supervised gardens and calculated appearances at the same dinners, until Edmund's letter, the one still folded in Constance's drawer upstairs, arrived the following spring and made the whole quiet arrangement official at last. The refreshments at a ball like that one deserve a small mention too, because ices, frozen desserts flavoured with fruit or cream, were considered a particular mark of a lavish and fashionable hostess, genuinely difficult and expensive to produce reliably in an era before mechanical refrigeration, requiring ice cut from frozen lakes or ponds the previous winter and stored, packed in straw, in a deep ice house dug into the ground specifically for this purpose, sometimes for months at a stretch, to be chipped away and used exactly when needed for an event like this one. A hostess who could offer her guests ices in the middle of a warm ballroom, in defiance of the season and the room's own heat, was making a small, edible statement about the depth of her household's resources that every guest present understood perfectly well, even as they simply enjoyed the sweetness melting a little too quickly on their tongues. Monday, in most households of this era, including the Ashbys, carries a specific and slightly dreaded identity all its own, known informally as Wash Day, or sometimes Blue Monday, and though tomorrow is only Wednesday, I want to tell you about it now, while we are still lingering in this quiet, wide-ranging mood, because it is one of the most physically demanding rituals of the entire domestic week, and one that shapes the rhythm of everything else around it. Laundry, in a household without any of the mechanical assistance we take entirely for granted now, is an enormous undertaking, beginning before dawn with water heated in a large copper boiler set into the kitchen, or a dedicated scullery, into which the household's linens, sheets, shirts, undergarments and table linens are sorted, soaked, and boiled in batches, each batch requiring careful attention to temperature and timing that only experience can properly teach. Whites are treated with a substance called blue, a small fabric bag containing a blue pigment, usually a compound derived from indigo, or a synthetic equivalent by this point in the century, dipped briefly into the rinse water in a quantity precise enough to counteract the slight yellowish cast that white fabric develops over time, without actually turning the fabric visibly blue itself, a trick of colour theory that housemaids learnt by feel and repetition rather than any formal instruction, since a single moment too long in the blue water could ruin an entire batch of the family's good linen sheets. After washing comes wringing, done by hand or, in slightly more modern households, through a mangle, a device with two heavy rollers that fabric is fed through to squeeze out excess water, a task that requires real upper body strength and carries a genuine, well-known household hazard of caught fingers, serious enough that mangle-related injuries appear with some regularity in the medical literature of the era. Ironing follows, often not until the next day given how long a full wash takes to complete and dry, using heavy flat irons heated directly on the kitchen range, a task requiring several irons in rotation since each one cools within minutes of use and must be swapped for a freshly heated one while the cooling iron goes back to the fire, all of it performed in a kitchen already stifling from the boiler's steam and the range's heat, regardless of the season outside. Constance's own household, being modest but comfortable, sends its heaviest and most difficult items, sheets and tablecloths especially, out to a professional laundress 2 streets over, a woman who takes in washing from several households in the neighbourhood, and runs what amounts to a small, physically brutal business entirely on her own, while Sarah and the parlour maid handle the smaller, more personal items of laundry at home themselves, still a full day's labour even with the heaviest pieces sent elsewhere. Let me shift now to something gentler and a little closer to Constance's own private preoccupations tonight, which is the question of what a girl in this era was actually taught and what she was not. Constance's own education, typical for a girl of her class, consisted heavily of what were called accomplishments: piano, watercolour painting, a working knowledge of French sufficient for polite conversation though rarely fluent enough for genuine literary reading, needlework of increasing complexity, and enough basic arithmetic to manage a household's accounts competently, but almost nothing in the way of the classical education, Latin, higher mathematics, natural philosophy, that her brother received as a matter of course at the same age, attending first a proper school and later, briefly, university. doors that were simply not open to Constance regardless of her own intellectual appetite, which, if her secret notebook upstairs is any evidence, was considerable. This is in fact precisely the argument occupying the half-finished piece in that hidden notebook, an argument Constance has been building for weeks now, that the gap between what a clever girl and a merely adequate boy were offered in the way of education said far more about the assumptions of the era than about any genuine difference in capacity between them, and she has, over the months of working on it, gathered a small private collection of counterexamples, women she has read about or heard of, who managed, against the current of everything they were taught to expect, to become genuinely serious scholars, writers and thinkers, evidence, in her own mind, that the limitation was never really about ability at all. There is real change stirring in this exact area, even as Constance writes tonight. Legal change specifically, since a piece of legislation passed a handful of years earlier finally allowed a married woman in England to own property in her own name for the first time, rather than seeing everything she brought into a marriage automatically become her husband's alone the moment she said her vows, a change Constance discusses when she can find a sympathetic ear with a quiet, fierce interest that would surprise almost everyone at tonight's dinner table, every one of whom knows her only as a graceful hostess with an excellent sense for seating arrangements. There is a particular ritual I have not told you about yet, and it happens every single afternoon in the Ashby household, without fail, rain or shine, guests or no guests, which is afternoon tea, taken around 4 or past, a genuinely fixed point in the day's architecture that Constance would find deeply disorienting to skip. The custom, as most people now understand it, is often credited to a specific woman, a duchess who is said to have found the long stretch between a light luncheon and a fashionably late dinner, sometimes not served until 8 or 9 in the evening, simply too hollow to bear without something in between, and began requesting tea and small cakes brought to her room in the late afternoon, a private habit that spread outward through her social circle until it became, within a generation or two, an entirely standard fixture of respectable daily life across the whole of England, rich and modest households alike, adapted according to what each could afford. For Constance, on an ordinary day without guests, this means a tray brought to whichever room she happens to be sitting in, tea in the good but not the very best china, and a small plate of thin bread and butter, sometimes with a scraping of jam, occasionally a slice of seed cake if Mrs. Handley has had time to bake that week. On a day with callers, as we saw earlier, the ritual becomes considerably more elaborate, but even in its plainest, most private form, taken alone with a book or with the children briefly released from the nursery to join her, the 4 o'clock tea marks a genuine, protected pause in a day that otherwise runs almost entirely on obligation, and Constance has come, over 9 years of marriage, to treasure it rather more than she would ever admit to anyone directly, a small daily ceremony of warmth and hot liquid, and 15 quiet minutes that belong to nobody's expectations but her own. I want to tell you something about the tea itself, actually, because it carries its own small oddity worth knowing. Tea, by this point in the century, has become thoroughly affordable and thoroughly ordinary across almost every level of English society, but it was not always so, and within living memory of Constance's own grandmother, tea had been expensive enough that fashionable households kept it locked in a specific piece of furniture called a tea caddy, often fitted with an actual lock and key, the mistress of the house personally measuring out each day's ration, rather than trusting the servants with unrestricted access to a substance valuable enough to be worth the temptation of pilfering. Constance's own tea caddy, inherited from that same grandmother, still has its little lock, though nobody in the household has bothered to use it in years, since tea today costs a small enough fraction of what it once did, that guarding it so carefully would strike most people in her circle as faintly comic, a leftover habit from an era when the calculus of household economy looked very different indeed. Let me tell you too about the market, because I skipped over it earlier, and I think it deserves a proper moment, one of the genuinely sensory experiences of Constance week, even though she does not do the marketing herself in any regular sense, that task falling mostly to Mrs. Handley, who goes out most mornings to select the day's meat and vegetables fresh, since even a household with an icebox has nothing resembling reliable refrigeration by modern standards, which means food shopping happens in small quantities, frequently, rather than in the large weekly trips a modern household would recognize. Mrs. Handley knows, from years of practice, precisely which butcher on the high street can be trusted not to pass off yesterday's meat as today's, precisely which fishmonger's ice has genuinely kept the morning's catch properly cold, rather than merely looking cold from a distance, a set of small, hard-won judgments that no cookbook could ever fully teach, and that represents in its own quiet way a genuine professional expertise, even if nobody in this era would have thought to call it that. Constance does occasionally accompany her, more for the pleasure of the outing than any real necessity, and the market itself on a good morning is a genuinely overwhelming wash of sound and colour and smell, stall holders calling out prices and the particular qualities of their goods in a competitive, half-performed patter that varies from cheerful to nearly aggressive depending on the seller, the smell of fresh bread from one stall colliding within a few feet with the sharper, less pleasant smell of a fishmonger's morning catch, baskets of produce arranged with a real visual artistry by sellers who understand, as well as any modern shop window designer, that a beautifully arranged pile of apples sells faster than a careless one. Constance finds these mornings, when she can spare the time for them, genuinely restorative in a way she has never quite been able to explain to Edmund, who cannot understand why his wife would choose the noise and mud of a market over the quiet comfort of home, and she has more or less given up trying to explain it to him, filing it away instead as one more small thing that belongs only to her. There is a photograph album kept in the drawing room, distinct from the family album upstairs, that holds the more private, more personal images, including the one we mentioned earlier of Edmund's sister. And this drawing room album serves an entirely different, almost social purpose, filled with small photographs called cartes de visite, a French term that had become standard English usage by this point, each one roughly the size of a modern playing card, mounted on stiff cardboard, and traded, collected, and displayed with an enthusiasm that genuinely rivaled how a later century would treat trading cards, or, later still, social media profiles. Visitors to a Victorian drawing room were commonly invited to look through the household's album, which typically included not only photographs of family members, but also, purchased commercially and inserted right alongside them, images of famous figures of the day, popular actresses, respected statesmen, occasionally even the Queen herself, all mixed together in the same album, with the same casual intimacy as photographs of one's own children, a strange collapsing of public and private that Constance has simply always known as normal, but that, described plainly, sounds almost bizarre. Complete strangers filed into a family photo album beside a beloved grandmother and a favourite cousin. Constance's own album includes, tucked a few pages in, a small photograph of a popular actress of the moment that she purchased herself from a shop 2 years ago, purely because she admired the woman's striking, unconventional beauty, a small private indulgence that Edmund finds mildly amusing and has never once questioned, since collecting such cards was, by this point, such an ordinary and widespread hobby that it would have seemed odder for a fashionable household not to have a few celebrity cards mixed in among the family faces. Pets, too, occupied an interesting and somewhat contradictory place in a household like this one. We have already talked about the stuffed kitten in the parlour, but Constance's current cat, very much alive, a marmalade Tom named Whiskey, who is at this moment curled on the end of Constance's own bed upstairs, waiting for her return, occupies a role that would feel entirely familiar to anyone today, indulged, spoken to in the particular foolish voice reserved specifically for pets, fed small scraps from the table, despite Constance's own stated rule against it, a rule she breaks herself more often than any of the children ever do. Dog ownership among Constance's wider circle carries its own set of small class signals worth mentioning, since the specific breed a household kept said something about its aspirations, a small, elegant lapdog suggesting a certain kind of decorative gentility, while a larger sporting breed suggested a household with genuine countryside connections and the land to exercise such an animal properly, distinctions that everyone in Constance's world absorbed so thoroughly they rarely needed to think about them consciously at all. I want to tell you about one more oddity before we begin easing properly towards sleep, because I think it belongs here, in this late wandering stretch of the night, more than it would have belonged earlier when we were still moving briskly between subjects. It concerns the complexion again, the same subject that opened our evening together in that chemist's shop on Regent Street, because the arsenic wafers were only the most extreme end of a much broader, deeply serious cultural obsession with achieving and maintaining pale, flawless skin, understood not merely as an aesthetic preference, but as a genuine marker of respectability and health. A tan, or even simple sun-darkened skin from ordinary outdoor activity, was strongly associated with manual labor, with the outdoor work of the poor, and a fashionable woman went to real, sometimes elaborate lengths to avoid it entirely. Wide-brimmed bonnets, parasols carried even on overcast days, gloves worn constantly, and, for those who could afford it, a whole cabinet of creams and washes, promising to lighten, even, and perfect the skin, many of them, like the wafers, containing ingredients that ranged from merely useless to genuinely dangerous by any modern standard, lead in some older formulations from earlier decades, mercury in certain complexion washes still sold well into Constance's own time, sold without any of the labeling or regulation that would eventually, many decades later, make such products illegal. Constance herself uses a simple mixture of glycerin and rosewater most nights, a gentle, genuinely harmless combination compared to some of the alternatives available to her, applied carefully to her face and hands before bed, in the same unhurried, habitual way she brushes her hair, and she has, on more than one occasion, quietly declined a friend's enthusiastic recommendation of some newer, more dramatic preparation, having developed over the years a mild, well-founded suspicion of anything that promised results too good, too quickly, to be entirely believable. Constance's Aunt Beatrice, who visited just last month and stayed nearly a week, tells a story every single time she comes, one the whole family has heard so many times they could recite it along with her, about attending the Great Exhibition as a young girl of 12, back in 1851, when the enormous glass and iron structure known as the Crystal Palace rose up in Hyde Park, filled with an almost incomprehensible variety of manufactured objects and inventions gathered from across the world, and Aunt Beatrice describes, every single time, with exactly the same wide-eyed wonder she must have genuinely felt as a child, walking beneath a ceiling of glass so vast it seemed to swallow the sky itself, past exhibits of machinery, textiles, sculpture, and curiosities from every corner of the British Empire and beyond. 6 million visitors passing through its doors over the course of that single summer, a number so large that it is genuinely difficult, even now, to picture properly. The exhibition, in Aunt Beatrice's telling, represented something the whole family still half believes without quite examining the belief too closely, a confident, unstoppable sense of progress, that the century itself was climbing steadily and permanently upward, each decade an improvement on the last, technology and empire and manners all advancing together towards some increasingly comfortable and rational future. Constance, listening to this story again last month for perhaps the 15th time in her life, found herself wondering, not for the first time, what her own children would tell their grandchildren about this exact era, this exact decade, and which of its confident certainties would look, from far enough away, as strange and dated as some of the exhibits Aunt Beatrice describes now look to Constance herself. Sarah, the young housemaid, gets a half-day off every other Sunday, a modest but genuine allowance of personal time that Constance, to her own quiet credit, has always made sure is honoured properly, having heard enough stories from other households where a servant's promised free time was casually cancelled whenever it proved inconvenient to the family's own plans. On her free afternoons, Sarah generally walks to see her own mother, who works in service herself 2 miles away, in a household considerably grander and considerably less generous than the Ashbys, and the two of them share whatever small treats Sarah can afford from her modest wages, tea and a bun, at a shop that caters specifically to servants on their afternoon out, an entire small, largely invisible social world of domestic workers meeting, gossiping, and briefly relaxing together on their scattered half-days, running in parallel beneath the more visible social world of their employers, with its own etiquette, its own gossip, its own quiet hierarchies, that Constance, for all her genuine fondness for Sarah, will never fully see or understand from where she sits. This, I think, is worth sitting with for a moment before we finally let Constance go to sleep, because it threads through nearly everything we have talked about tonight without ever being named directly. almost every comfort we have described this evening, the fire already lit before Constance wakes, the hot water carried up 3 flights of stairs, the newspaper ironed smooth, the 7-course dinner appearing on schedule without a single visible seam of effort, rests on a foundation of labour performed by people whose own lives, whose own small oddities and rituals and secret rooms we have barely glimpsed at all tonight. Mrs. Handley's cracked, capable hands, Sarah's careful fire-laying learned before she was even a teenager, the borrowed butler managing an unfamiliar house smoothly enough that only Constance ever noticed the 2 small slips all evening. Constance herself is aware of this, more aware than many women of her class and era, in a way that connects quietly back to that hidden notebook and its half-finished argument about education and opportunity, though even her awareness, real as it is, does not change the fundamental shape of the world she lives inside, only her own private, complicated relationship to it. There is one more small ritual I want to walk you through before Constance finally climbs into bed, and it concerns her gloves, because I think it captures in miniature just how much invisible labour and invisible thought went into maintaining even the smallest, most ordinary accessories of a respectable Victorian woman's wardrobe. Kid gloves, the soft, fine leather gloves Constance wears for calling, for church, for nearly every occasion that takes her beyond her own front door, could not simply be washed the way a modern person might wash a garment. They required a specific, careful process, cleaned while still on the hand in some methods, using a mixture that might include a small amount of spirits or a specially formulated glove cleaner sold for exactly this purpose, rubbed gently into the leather and worked through with a soft cloth before being left to dry slowly, away from direct heat, which would crack the delicate material beyond repair. A single pair of good kid gloves represented a real expense, and a woman of Constance's means owned several pairs in various colours and weights, each one requiring this careful maintenance if it was to last through more than a handful of wearings, a small, recurring chore that Constance actually rather enjoys, in a way she finds slightly difficult to explain, something meditative in the careful, repetitive motion of it, not unlike the 100 strokes of the hairbrush that began her evening. Hats, too, carried their own elaborate maintenance requirements and their own strict rules of etiquette, indoor and outdoor wear governed by distinctions that seem almost impossibly fine-grained from a modern vantage point. A lady removed her bonnet indoors when visiting a private home for any extended stay, but kept it on for a brief formal call, the exact threshold between the 2 situations, understood instinctively by everyone raised within the system, and genuinely confusing to anyone attempting to learn it from the outside as an adult. Constance's own collection of hats and bonnets occupies an entire shelf of her wardrobe, each one trimmed and retrimmed over the years as fashions shift, since a full bonnet was expensive enough that most women, even comfortable ones like Constance, updated the trimming, ribbons, flowers, feathers, rather than purchasing an entirely new hat every time the fashionable silhouette changed even slightly, a small practical economy that ran underneath even genuinely wealthy households, far more often than the popular image of endless Victorian extravagance would suggest. I keep returning tonight to this idea of extraordinary minds working within genuinely narrow rooms, because it feels like the true thread running under everything we have looked at this evening, the arsenic wafers and the calling cards and the crossed letters and the notebook hidden behind a false panel in a writing desk. This exact era, for all its restrictions, for all the very real narrowness of what a woman like Constance was permitted to do publicly with her own considerable intelligence, also produced women who pushed against those walls hard enough to leave real, lasting marks on the world beyond her drawing room. A nurse who transformed the entire practice of hospital care through sheer force of organizational will and statistical argument. A novelist, publishing at first under a man's name for exactly the reasons Constance publishes her own smaller pieces under initials, whose books remain, more than a century later, among the finest ever written in the English language. A physician who spent years being refused entry to medical schools before finally forcing open a door that had simply never been open to a woman before, and who then spent the rest of her career holding it open for the women who came after her. None of these women are Constance. She would be the first to say so, without any particular bitterness, simply as a plain fact about the shape of her own considerably smaller, considerably more private life. But something of the same pressure runs through both, the same mind straining gently, persistently, against a room built smaller than the mind itself, and I find that thought, more than almost anything else we have discussed tonight, genuinely moving to sit with. There is a whole layer of small household superstition running underneath the formal etiquette we have spent most of tonight discussing, quieter, less official, passed down through servants and mothers rather than printed in any etiquette manual, and I think it deserves a few minutes before we finally close the day properly. When Edmund's mother died 14 months ago, every mirror in the house where she passed was covered with dark cloth within hours, a widespread custom rooted in an old belief that an uncovered mirror might trap the soul of the newly departed, or, in a slightly different version of the same underlying anxiety, that a mourner catching sight of their own grief-stricken reflection too soon after a death invited a second tragedy to follow the first. Clocks in a house of mourning were traditionally stopped at the moment of death and not restarted until after the funeral, a small, symbolic suspension of ordinary time that Constance's own household observed without anyone needing to explain why, the way most deeply embedded customs simply get followed rather than reasoned through in the moment. Smaller superstitions thread through Constance's ordinary days too, mostly unexamined, simply present. Spilling salt at the table calls for a small pinch thrown immediately over the left shoulder to blind whatever ill luck might be lurking there waiting to take advantage of the spill. An opened umbrella indoors is quietly, instinctively avoided by nearly everyone in the household, though nobody could tell you with any confidence where the belief actually originated. A single magpie glimpsed through the window prompts, even from Edmund, who would insist under direct questioning that he does not believe a word of it, a small private acknowledgement, a nod or a murmured greeting to the bird, following an old rhyme about counting magpies for luck that every child in England seems to absorb before they are old enough to remember learning it. None of this sits in any real tension in Constance's mind with her own quite genuine, quite orthodox religious faith. The superstitions occupy an entirely separate, older layer of belief, folk custom rather than doctrine, and most people in her world move between the two without ever feeling the need to reconcile them logically, the same way a modern person might avoid walking under a ladder without believing, in any serious sense, that doing so would summon actual misfortune. Let me tell you too about the particular strangeness of a Victorian dinner table's more ambitious dishes, because I think the actual food itself, beyond the etiquette governing how it was eaten, deserves a moment of your attention. Calf's foot jelly, a savoury or sometimes sweetened gelatin made by boiling down calves' feet for their natural setting properties, was considered both a genuinely fashionable dish for entertaining and a restorative food specifically recommended for invalids and the recently ill, believed to be easily digestible and strengthening in ways that modern nutritional science would view rather more skeptically. Turtle soup, made from actual turtle meat imported live from the Caribbean at real expense, or, for households unable to manage the genuine article, from a cheaper substitute made with calf's head that was cheerfully marketed as mock turtle soup, a dish so common that a fictional character built entirely around the joke of a creature that is not quite what its name suggests became, within Constance's own lifetime, instantly recognizable to any English reader without a single word of explanation required. Blancmange, a cold, moulded dessert set with gelatin, or, in earlier versions, ground almonds, appeared at nearly every dinner party of any ambition, formed into elaborate shapes using decorative moulds that a household might collect in considerable numbers, animals, castles, elaborate geometric patterns, each dessert a small edible display of the cook's skill and the household's investment in the proper equipment to achieve it. Introductions themselves followed a precision that, once you understand it, explains a great deal about how careful everyone in Constance's world was about names and titles. A person of lower social rank was always introduced to a person of higher rank, never the reverse, the logic being that it was the lesser-ranked individual's privilege to be presented, the greater-ranked individual's decision whether to acknowledge the introduction warmly or coolly, and Constance has watched, more than once, a hostess move through a room full of guests with a genuinely impressive mental map of exactly who outranked whom, by title, by age, by marital status, by her husband's professional standing, adjusting her introductions accordingly without ever seeming to consult anything but instinct. A married woman was addressed formally using her husband's full name, Mrs. Edmund Ashby, rather than Mrs. Constance Ashby, on formal correspondence and calling cards, her own given name essentially disappearing from her public identity the moment she married, folded entirely into his, a detail Constance noticed keenly as a new bride and has, over 9 years, stopped noticing at all, the way any strange thing eventually becomes simply the water you swim in. Needlework occupied a peculiar double position in Constance's world, treated simultaneously as a genuinely necessary practical skill and as one of the primary sanctioned ways a lady was permitted to spend her leisure hours without appearing idle. Constance can mend a torn hem competently, embroider a respectable border on a handkerchief, and has, over the years, produced several genuinely accomplished pieces of decorative needlework, now framed and hung in the upstairs hallway. But she has also come to understand, more clearly as she has aged, that needlework's real social function had less to do with the finished object and more to do with occupying a woman's visible hands during the long stretches of the day when sitting with nothing to do at all would have read as suspiciously idle. A woman with needlework in her lap during a call, during an evening in the drawing room, during nearly any social occasion that did not specifically call for full attention elsewhere, was understood to be properly, virtuously occupied, regardless of how little actual concentration the stitching itself required, which meant the needlework often ran on a kind of parallel track alongside the conversation happening around it, hands moving nearly automatically while the real attention went entirely to whatever was being discussed. Music, too, held real importance in the household, though Constance's own relationship to the piano has shifted meaningfully over the years, from the anxious, performance-oriented practice of her girlhood, drilled by a strict governess specifically to produce a marriageable accomplishment, towards something closer to genuine private pleasure now, late in the evening, after the children are settled, when she plays not for any audience at all, but simply because the particular quality of concentration the instrument demands empties her mind in a way little else manages to do. She thinks, sometimes, about how strange it is that an activity forced on her as a girl, for entirely instrumental, marriage market reasons, has become, unexpectedly, one of the genuine private comforts of her adult life. Evidence, perhaps, that even a system built around obligation and performance occasionally produces something real and unplanned inside it. The seaside, when the Ashbys can manage the expense and Edmund can spare the time from his practice, means a fortnight taken most summers at a modest resort town on the south coast, considerably less grand than the fashionable spots frequented by the truly wealthy, but pleasant enough, with its own bathing machines, its own promenade for the fashionable evening walk that constitutes most of a seaside holiday's actual social activity, its own small assembly rooms where a modest dance might be held once or twice during the family's stay. Constance genuinely loves these fortnights, the specific quality of light off open water, the children released to build sandcastles and collect shells under Ruth's watchful supervision, the sheer physical relief of London's coal smoke replaced, for 2 whole weeks, by salt air that leaves everything, hair, clothing, skin, smelling faintly and pleasantly of the sea, rather than the city's usual grey haze. She has already begun, tonight in fact, thinking ahead to next summer's arrangements, though it remains 8 months distant, a small private anticipation she allows herself on nights like this one, when the day's obligations are finally, properly behind her. Let me tell you a little about how Constance's own children arrived into this world and into this household, because the customs surrounding birth in this era carry their own particular strangeness worth a gentle mention before we finally let the night close around us. When her daughter was born, 9 years ago now, Constance observed what was called a lying-in period, a stretch of several weeks following the birth during which a new mother was expected to remain largely confined to her bedroom, resting, recovering, and receiving only a small circle of close family and intimate friends, a custom rooted partly in genuine medical caution, since childbirth in this era carried real and serious risk that everyone in Constance's world understood keenly, and partly in a broader social belief that a new mother required this protected, cocooned period before rejoining the ordinary demands of household and social life. Friends and relations who called during this time and who were admitted past the lying-in restrictions traditionally brought a small gift of caudle, a warm, spiced drink made with wine or ale, thickened with eggs and sugar, believed to be strengthening and restorative for a mother still recovering her full strength, a custom that had largely faded from the most fashionable circles by Constance's own childbearing years, but that her own mother still observed faithfully, arriving with a small covered jug each time, insisting Constance drink at least a cup while she visited. Christening, when it came a few weeks later for each child, was a formal, carefully planned occasion in its own right, godparents selected with real strategic consideration, since the role carried genuine social and sometimes practical weight, a promise of guidance and support that respectable families took seriously rather than treating as a purely ceremonial title. Both of Constance's children wear, on the rare occasions the garment is brought out, a christening gown that has been in Edmund's family for 3 generations, white, elaborately embroidered, long enough to trail well past the wearer's feet regardless of the infant's actual size, a garment so delicate that Constance handles it now when she takes it out to show a visiting relative with something close to reverence, aware that it has dressed Edmund himself, Edmund's father, and now both of her own children. A small, tangible thread of continuity running through a family that otherwise leaves so little physical evidence of itself behind. Teething, in the era's popular medical understanding, was blamed for an almost comically broad range of infant complaints, fevers, digestive upset, general fretfulness, all attributed to the physical stress of teeth pushing through an infant's gums, regardless of whether any actual connection existed. And remedies ranged from the genuinely harmless, a hard rusk or a smooth ivory ring for the baby to chew against, to the considerably more concerning, teething powders and syrups that, like the soothing preparations we discussed earlier, not infrequently contained real, meaningful doses of substances no modern parent would ever knowingly give an infant. Constance, with both of her own children, favoured the plainer remedies, more out of a kind of instinctive caution than any real scientific understanding of why, a small quiet act of maternal protectiveness that she has never examined too closely, simply trusting the feeling without needing to justify it with evidence she did not actually possess. Toys, for children fortunate enough to be born into a household like this one, tended toward the instructive as much as the purely playful, dolls dressed in miniature versions of adult fashion that doubled, whether intentionally or not, as a kind of early education in the elaborate business of Victorian dress, building blocks that spelled out letters, simple board games designed around moral or educational themes rather than pure amusement. Constance's son has a small tin soldier collection, painstakingly hand-painted, that he arranges into elaborate battle formations across the nursery floor for hours at a stretch, a pastime Constance finds herself watching sometimes with a small, complicated pang, aware that the wooden and tin battles he stages so cheerfully now sit rather closer to a real, adult future than either of them currently likes to think about, given the Empire's various ongoing military entanglements scattered across the globe that occasionally, quietly, touch even a household as sheltered as this one. There is a small mending basket that lives permanently beside Constance's favourite chair in the drawing room, and I want to tell you about it because darning, the specific, careful art of repairing a worn hole in a stocking or a sleeve by weaving new thread across the gap in a tight, load-bearing lattice, was a skill every respectable woman of Constance's generation learned as a girl and practiced for the whole of her life, regardless of how wealthy her household eventually became. It would have been possible, of course, for a woman of Constance's means to simply discard a worn stocking and purchase a new pair, but the instinct against waste ran deep enough, culturally, that even households that could easily afford replacement still mended as a matter of course, partly practical economy and partly something closer to a genuine domestic virtue, the visible evidence of a woman's diligence and thrift stitched right into the heel of a sock nobody but her own household would ever actually see. Constance darns most evenings, a handful of items at a time, her needle moving in the small practiced motion that requires so little conscious thought by this point in her life that she often finds her best private thinking happens exactly here, hands busy, mind free, the mending basket serving as an unlikely companion to whatever quiet mental work is actually occupying her that particular evening. The bookshelf in the corner of the drawing room holds a modest but genuine library, mostly novels, a good deal of poetry, a handful of improving works on history and travel that Edmund reads more than Constance does, and a small, well-worn set of etiquette manuals that Constance still consults occasionally, even after 9 years of marriage, whenever some new social situation presents a wrinkle she has not previously encountered. Reading for a woman of her class occupied an interesting middle position, encouraged as a genteel, improving pastime in the abstract, while certain specific categories of reading material, the more sensational novels particularly, the ones dealing frankly with adultery, with financial ruin, with the darker undercurrents of respectable society, were regarded with real suspicion, considered potentially corrupting to a young, impressionable, unmarried reader, in a way that a married woman of Constance's age and settled temperament was assumed to have safely outgrown. Constance reads these more scandalous novels anyway, without apology, has done for years, and has passed a select few along quietly to Cecilia, her younger friend, with the specific instruction that Cecilia's own mother need not know precisely what she is reading in the privacy of her own room, a small, ongoing act of quiet rebellion so gentle and so common among women of Constance's circle that it barely registers as rebellion at all, more a kind of open secret everyone participates in and nobody officially acknowledges. There is a particular heirloom sitting on the mantelpiece I have not mentioned yet, a small carriage clock that belonged to Edmund's grandfather, wound faithfully every single night by Edmund himself as one of the last small tasks of his day, a habit passed down, as far as anyone in the family can trace it, for 3 generations without interruption, the clock itself having ticked through births, deaths, a house fire in Edmund's father's generation that the clock remarkably survived intact, and now the whole quiet architecture of Constance's own household, its dinners and its wash days and its Sunday observances, all measured out beneath the steady, unbroken sound of the same small mechanism that measured out the household before her, and will, in all likelihood, go on measuring out whatever household comes after. Winter, which is properly settling in now outside the Ashby windows this particular November, brings its own set of small seasonal rituals worth mentioning before we let Constance finally rest. Coal deliveries increase substantially through the colder months, great sacks of it hauled by a coalman whose face and hands by the end of a working day carry a permanent grey-black film that no amount of washing seems to fully lift, deposited through a chute directly into the coal cellar beneath the house, a genuinely filthy, physically demanding trade that keeps every fire in every respectable household across London burning through the winter, and that Constance, watching from an upstairs window as the coalman makes his delivery most weeks, has never once thought to ask the price of, in any sense beyond the money that changes hands, though she has, in her more reflective evenings, begun to wonder about it rather more than she once did. The chimney sweep, too, makes his rounds with particular frequency this time of year, since a chimney choked with soot from months of heavy fires poses a genuine fire risk that every prudent household takes seriously. Constance still remembers, with a discomfort she has never quite resolved, that within her own living memory, chimney sweeping was performed by small boys, some as young as 6 or 7, sent up inside the narrow flue itself to scrape the soot loose by hand and body, a practice that had already become the subject of real public outcry and eventual legal restriction by the time her own children were born, restrictions that Constance genuinely supports, and yet she remembers, uncomfortably, that Edmund's own father spoke of the old climbing boys with a kind of casual, unexamined nostalgia that always makes her a little quiet when the subject comes up at family dinners, a small, specific reminder that the moral distance between her own comfortable era and the genuinely darker practices, only 1 generation behind it, was considerably thinner than most people in her circle liked to acknowledge out loud. There is a smaller, gentler oddity I want to close this particular thread with, which is the moustache cup, a small piece of tableware genuinely popular among fashionable gentlemen of this decade, a teacup fitted with a small ceramic ledge across part of the rim, specifically designed to hold an elaborately waxed and styled moustache clear of the hot liquid while its owner drank, protecting both the wax from melting and the moustache from dipping, unfortunately, into the tea itself. Edmund does not own one, finding the whole idea a touch too fussy for his own taste, but Constance's brother-in-law swears by his, and the sight of him carefully positioning his cup at exactly the right angle every single time he drinks tea has become, over the years, a small, reliable source of gentle family amusement that nobody, including the brother-in-law himself, seems to mind in the slightest. Veils, the small tips traditionally given by a guest to a household servants upon departing from a visit, particularly an overnight stay, represent one more small economic thread worth mentioning, a custom old enough that it was already fading somewhat by Constance's time, considered by some hosts genuinely improper, since a guest tipping the servants could be read as a subtle, uncomfortable suggestion that the host himself was not paying his own staff adequately, while other, older-fashioned households still expected and quietly relied on the practice as a real supplement to servants' modest formal wages. The Ashbys have settled, as many households of their moderate means have, on a middle position, gently discouraging veils from guests, while making certain, privately, that their own servants' Christmas gifts and occasional bonuses are generous enough to make up whatever small difference the custom's decline might otherwise have left in Sarah's and Mrs. Handley's pockets. A new family moving into a house on the street carries its own small, specific etiquette worth mentioning, since Constance herself went through precisely this ritual from the other side 9 years ago, newly married and newly arrived on this very street, waiting with a nervousness she still remembers clearly for the established households nearby to decide whether and when to call. The custom held that established residents, not newcomers, initiated the first contact, calling on a new family within a reasonable window after their arrival was noticed, since a newcomer calling first, uninvited, on households she did not yet know, risked appearing presumptuous, pushing herself forward into a social circle that had not yet indicated it wished to receive her. Constance remembers the specific relief of the first calling card, left at her own new door in her first week on this street, evidence that she had been noticed, judged acceptable and welcomed, at least provisionally, into the web of obligation and friendship that would come to define so much of her daily life in the years since. Servants moving between positions relied on a document called a character, essentially a written reference from a previous employer, without which finding a new respectable position was genuinely difficult, since no prudent household would hire domestic staff without some verified account of their honesty, competence, and general conduct in a previous household. This system carried real power over a servant's livelihood, and Constance is aware, in the specific way she is aware of most of the quiet imbalances running underneath her comfortable household, that a poor character, whether fairly or unfairly given, could follow a servant for years, closing doors that a more generous or more honest reference might have kept open, a small, largely unregulated exercise of power that rested almost entirely with the employer and almost never with the person actually being judged. Constance has written exactly 2 characters herself for servants who left her employment under entirely amicable circumstances, and she remembers taking real care over both, aware, even as she wrote them, of exactly how much weight her own careful sentences would carry in a stranger's decision about a young woman's future. Edmund's work itself touches Constance's day only at its edges, mentioned briefly over dinner, referenced in the occasional late evening when a difficult case keeps him at his chambers past the usual hour, and there is a particular category of legal and financial vocabulary, entail, settlement, jointure, that Constance has absorbed thoroughly over 9 years of marriage without ever having received any formal instruction in it, simply through proximity, the way anyone eventually learns the specialized language of a household they live inside long enough. A marriage settlement, negotiated before her own wedding by her father and Edmund together, established specific financial protections for Constance in the event of Edmund's death, a document she has read only once, on her wedding day itself, and has thought about only rarely since, though she is aware, in the same quiet, unexamined way she is aware of the coal cellar and the servants' half-days, that the entire comfortable architecture of her present life rests on legal arrangements made by 2 men on her behalf before she had fully become the woman who would actually have to live inside them. The gas lamps throughout the house, fitted only within the last decade, replacing the oil lamps and candles that lit Constance's own girlhood home, still strike her occasionally, on quiet evenings like this one, as a small domestic marvel worth noticing rather than simply taking for granted, a soft, steady hiss and glow at the turn of a small brass tap, none of the flickering unevenness or the constant trimming of wicks that oil lamps demanded. Not every room in the house has been fitted for gas. The attic servants' quarters still rely on candles alone, a small, telling detail about whose comfort gets prioritized first when a household modernizes gradually rather than all at once, and Constance, turning down the gas in the drawing room now as she prepares finally to go up, finds herself thinking, not for the first time, about how much of what feels to her like simple, unremarkable modern convenience is actually a set of choices about whose evenings get to be brightly lit and whose continue by candlelight, choices made so quietly and so far upstream of her own daily life that she rarely traces them all the way back to their source. Upstairs, the warming pan has already done its work in Constance's bed, a long-handled brass pan filled with hot coals from the kitchen fire, run briefly between the sheets an hour ago by Sarah, before being carried carefully back downstairs, leaving behind exactly the kind of gentle, even warmth that makes climbing into a cold November bed feel, instead, like climbing into something that has been quietly waiting to receive her. Whiskey, the marmalade cat, has not moved from his spot at the foot of the bed the entire evening, and he lifts his head only slightly as Constance finally enters the room, blinking at her with the specific, unhurried indifference cats reserve for people they trust completely, before settling back down as she begins, at last, the final small rituals of her day. She removes the plum silk dress with Edmund's help this time, rather than Sarah's, since he is already in the room himself, unfastening his own collar, and there is an easy practiced intimacy to the two of them undressing together at the end of a long evening that belongs entirely to married life, unhurried, unremarkable, the specific, comfortable silence of two people who have shared this exact small ritual several thousand times before, and expect, without either of them ever quite articulating it, to share it several thousand times more. Constance's hair comes down again, the elaborate evening arrangement unpinned and released, and she picks up her own brush one final time tonight, though she does not manage the full 100 strokes, too tired now, too close to sleep, perhaps 30 or 40, before she sets it down and climbs, finally, into the warmed sheets beside Edmund, who is already half asleep himself, one arm settling, out of long habit, around her waist. She thinks, in the last few minutes before sleep properly takes her, about the notebook downstairs, still tucked behind its false panel, the half-finished sentence waiting for tomorrow, or the day after, or whenever the next quiet 20 minutes presents itself. She thinks, briefly, about tomorrow's obligations, smaller than today's, a single call to make in the afternoon, nothing more, a genuinely restful day by comparison, and she feels, even through the fog of real tiredness, a small private gratitude for that. She thinks about Sarah, 2 floors above her now, and Mrs. Handley, already asleep in her own small room off the kitchen, both of them destined to wake in barely 5 hours to begin the whole quiet architecture of tomorrow's fires and hot water and ironed newspaper all over again. And she thinks, as she does most nights though never for very long, about how strange and how ordinary it all is at once, the wafers and the gloves and the calling cards and the crossed letters and the leeches behind the ear, an entire century of careful, invisible rules holding up something that, from the inside, on a night like tonight, simply feels like a life, hers, imperfect and constrained, and genuinely, quietly good. Before I let this house go fully quiet, I want to tell you about one more thing that lives in Constance's own social circle, something that would surprise a great many modern viewers who imagine this era as entirely buttoned up, entirely rational, entirely governed by the same restrained good sense we have spent the whole evening walking through. Spiritualism, the belief that the dead could be contacted through mediums, through table tipping, through rapping sounds interpreted as messages from beyond, swept through respectable Victorian society with a genuine widespread enthusiasm that sat, somewhat uneasily but quite persistently, right alongside conventional church attendance and orthodox religious belief. Constance attended a séance herself once, 3 years ago, at the home of a friend of Louisa's, a small gathering of perhaps 8 women seated around a table in a dimly lit room, hands lightly touching, waiting for the medium at the head of the table to fall into what she called a trance, and begin relaying messages from a departed relative of one of the guests present. Constance remains, to this day, genuinely uncertain what she witnessed that evening, whether the faint knocking sounds and the medium's oddly specific details about a deceased aunt's favourite brooch represented some genuine, inexplicable phenomenon, or simply a skilled performer reading her small nervous audience with real precision, and she has never fully resolved the question in her own mind, filing the whole experience away in the same mental drawer where she keeps a number of other things she cannot quite explain, and has decided, for now, not to worry over too closely. Fans, too, carried their own small elaborate language among fashionable women, a system of gestures, fan held closed against the lips, fan opened fully and slowly, fan drawn across the cheek, each supposedly carrying a specific coded meaning ranging from "I love you" to "leave me to follow me when you can," though Constance has always privately suspected this particular language was considerably more the invention of romantic novelists and etiquette manual writers eager to sell a charming idea than a system any real woman ever actually deployed with serious intent at an actual ball, a small, knowing skepticism she has never quite voiced aloud to anyone but Edmund, who found the whole idea, when she first explained it to him during their own courtship, thoroughly and openly ridiculous, which is one of several small reasons she fell for him in the first place. Autograph albums occupied the drawing rooms and school days of nearly every young woman of Constance's generation. Small bound books passed among friends and family members, each contributor asked to write a short verse, a piece of wisdom, or simply their signature and a small sentiment, and Constance's own album from her school years still sits in a drawer upstairs, filled with the careful, earnest handwriting of girls she has not seen in over a decade, some married and scattered across the country now, one or two, she knows with a small persistent sadness, no longer living at all, a physical, tangible record of an entire social world that existed briefly and completely before scattering the way every young woman's circle of school friends eventually scatters, no matter the century. The house, by now, has gone entirely quiet around her. The last of the fires banked low, the last gas lamp turned down, the street outside gone still except for the occasional distant clop of a cab horse making its way home somewhere several streets over, and the specific quality of London at this hour, this late in a November night, is something Constance has always found strangely peaceful despite the century's genuine and constant noise during every other hour of the day. A brief, reliable pocket of true stillness that the whole city seems to share collectively for these few hours before the coal deliveries and the milk carts and the first fires of tomorrow's households begin the entire cycle over again. Somewhere on the corner, 2 streets over, stands one of the bright red pillar boxes that have become, over the past couple of decades, a completely familiar fixture of every London street, though Constance's own mother still remembers a time before them, when posting a letter meant a trip to the receiving house proper, rather than simply dropping an envelope through a slot on a street corner and trusting the whole enormous invisible machinery of the postal service to carry it safely to wherever it needed to go. There is something Constance finds genuinely moving about that machinery when she stops to think about it properly. The sheer scale of it, sorters and postmen and mail trains and steamships all moving in a vast, coordinated rhythm every single day, so that a letter posted in her own hallway this morning might, by tomorrow, be read by a cousin in Edinburgh, or, given enough additional days, by a friend who emigrated to Australia 3 years ago and writes back faithfully every few months with news that always arrives feeling slightly out of date by the time it reaches Constance's hands. A small, built-in delay that everyone in her correspondence simply accepts as the ordinary shape of staying close to someone very far away. Every person in this house is asleep now, except, perhaps, in the specific way of very old houses that seem to hold a kind of quiet wakefulness even when everyone inside them has properly gone to rest. The children upstairs, curled under blankets that Ruth checked twice before retiring herself. Sarah and the parlour maid in their shared attic room, exhausted in the particular, dreamless way that comes from physical labour rather than mental strain, already deep asleep despite the early hour they will need to rise again. Mrs. Handley in her small room off the kitchen, the range banked low but not dead, ready to be coaxed back to full life in barely 5 hours' time. Whiskey the cat, finally settled properly at the foot of the bed rather than merely tolerating Constance's late arrival, and Constance herself, drifting now, the last of her thoughts loosening into the particular formless drift that precedes real sleep, the notebook downstairs, the plum silk dress hung carefully by Sarah before she too went up, the small ivory dance card from 17 years ago that still exists somewhere in a box of keepsakes she has not opened in longer than she could say, all of it settling, for tonight, into the quiet dark of a house that has done exactly this every single night, for as long as anyone currently living inside it can remember. I think what strikes me most, turning this particular evening over one final time before I let you go, is how much of what feels strange to us now felt, to Constance, and to millions of women very much like her across this exact stretch of the century, simply like Tuesday. The arsenic wafers were not a scandal to the women buying them. The stuffed kitten under its glass dome was not macabre to the family who kept it in their parlour and dusted it fondly every week. The 15-minute cooling visit, the folded corner on a card, the 100 strokes of the hairbrush, the notebook hidden behind a false panel, none of it registered, from the inside, as odd at all. It registered as simply how a life was lived, the accumulated, unremarkable texture of 10,000 small choices made the same way, day after day, by women who were managing enormous invisible labour and real if narrow private inner lives, all at once, all quietly, all without anyone thinking to write any of it down as anything worth remembering, and that, I think, is the real gift of an evening like this one. Not the strangeness itself, though I hope you have enjoyed collecting a little of it tonight, but the reminder that strangeness is almost always a matter of distance rather than substance. Someone, a century from now, dimming their own lights in whatever quiet dark their own century has arranged for sleeping, will very likely find something in the shape of your own ordinary Tuesday, just as odd as Constance's arsenic wafers seem to you tonight, and just as unremarkable, from the inside, as your own life currently feels to you. There is something almost comforting in that thought, I find, a small, quiet reminder that every era, including this exact one you are lying in right now, is simultaneously perfectly ordinary and, from far enough away, completely, gently strange. There is one more oddity I keep circling back to tonight, and I think it deserves its own proper telling before we let the last of the lights go out, because it concerns not Constance, but a category of men very much like Edmund's own circle of friends and colleagues. A certain kind of fashionable gentleman in this era, one whose own legs did not quite meet the era's preferred silhouette of a well-turned calf beneath a fitted trouser, or, in slightly earlier decades, a pair of breeches, could purchase what were discreetly called calf pads, small padded inserts worn inside the stocking or trouser leg, specifically to build out the shape of the leg into something closer to the fashionable ideal, a practice men participated in with roughly the same quiet, unremarked upon regularity that women applied rice powder or laced their corsets just slightly firmer than strictly comfortable. Edmund himself has never needed such an aid, being naturally built along lines the era happened to favour, but he has, on more than one occasion, mentioned a colleague at his chambers with a certain dry amusement, a man whose remarkably shapely calves are, according to reliable gossip that has somehow reached even Edmund's professional circle, not entirely his own natural inheritance. Moustache wax occupied a similarly serious place in a fashionable gentleman's morning toilette, and Constance has watched, with real fondness, her own brother spend a genuinely startling amount of time each morning working a small quantity of scented wax into the ends of his moustache, twisting the tips into sharp, precise points that held their shape through an entire day regardless of weather, a level of daily grooming effort that would surprise anyone who assumes Victorian masculinity ran entirely toward gruff unconcern with appearance. The most fashionable gentlemen of Constance's acquaintance maintained their facial hair with a level of daily discipline that rivaled, in its own way, the 90 minutes Constance herself spends most mornings on hair and complexion, evidence, if any more were needed, that vanity in this era was never quite so neatly divided along the lines of gender that popular imagination sometimes assumes. Eyebrows and eyelashes received their own share of quiet cosmetic attention too, though spoken of even more discreetly than the rice powder or the glycerin. since anything too close to visible artifice on the face carried real risk of a woman's reputation if word of it spread too widely among the wrong company. A dye derived from a plant substance, applied carefully with a small brush to darken pale lashes or fill in a thin brow, was available to women willing to seek it out, sold quietly by certain chemists and specialist perfumers, rather than displayed openly on a shop counter, the way the complexion wafers had been. And Constance, though she has never used such a preparation herself, having been fortunate enough to inherit lashes dark enough to need no assistance, knows at least 2 women in her circle who rely on it faithfully, a small secret they share with each other but would never dream of admitting to their own husbands, who are, in most cases, simply meant to believe such darkness occurs entirely by nature. Board games occupied a genuine and respectable place in the Ashby household's evening entertainments, particularly on the long dark evenings of deep winter, when even the most energetic family eventually tires of cards and conversation alone. Constance's children are, at their current ages, still mostly limited to simple games of chance and counting, but the family keeps, in a cabinet in the drawing room, a handsome set of chess pieces that Edmund taught Constance to play during their courtship, one of the genuine, ongoing pleasures of their marriage being the roughly even match they still provide each other after 9 years of practice. Evenings when the children are asleep and the house has gone quiet enough for real concentration, spent hunched together over a board that has travelled, unbroken, through the whole of their marriage so far. The particular etiquette governing a ballroom deserves one more small addition, because there is a rule I find genuinely poignant once you understand its full weight, which is that a young woman who found herself without a partner for a particular dance, sitting quietly against the wall while others took the floor, occupied a position with its own specific unkind name, a wallflower, a term still perfectly familiar and still, if anything, slightly more casually cruel in Constance's own era than it would eventually become in later, gentler usage. A thoughtful hostess took real care to ensure no young woman at her ball spent an entire evening in this position, quietly directing an obliging young gentleman toward a partnerless girl when the opportunity arose, a small, kind piece of social management that most guests never noticed happening at all, precisely because a skilled hostess made certain it never looked like management, only like the natural, effortless flow of a well-run evening. Constance remembers, from her own single season, a girl 2 years older than herself, perfectly pleasant, perfectly presentable, who simply did not take, as the phrase went, failing to secure the kind of attention that led toward an eventual proposal despite several full seasons of trying, and who eventually, by her late 20s, settled into the specific, quietly diminished social role reserved for women in exactly this position: useful aunt, permanent companion to an aging parent, occasional invitee to family gatherings but rarely to anything more glamorous. Her own independent story essentially folded, gently but completely, into the margins of everyone else's. Constance thinks of her sometimes, more than she would have expected to at 17, when she herself was simply relieved not to have shared that particular fate, and considerably more now, at 34, when she has enough distance and enough of her own private complexity to recognize how much genuine unfairness sat quietly behind a description as breezy and dismissive as she simply did not take. There is a weather diary kept faithfully in the household, actually a small ledger Edmund maintains more out of habit inherited from his own father than any genuine scientific interest, recording each day's temperature, rainfall, and general conditions in a neat, cramped hand, a practice common enough among households of a certain methodical temperament in this era, decades before any formal National Weather Service existed to do the same work more systematically, meaning that households like Edmund's small private records represent, in their scattered, uncoordinated way, one of the only records that will ever exist of exactly what a given Tuesday in November felt like on this particular street. Temperature and rainfall noted faithfully beside nothing more dramatic than the ordinary fact of an ordinary day passing. I want to tell you about one final household object before we close, small and easy to overlook, sitting on a side table in the front hall, a modest brass letter rack where the day's incoming post is displayed each morning, sorted and propped upright for anyone passing through the hall to see at a glance who has written to whom. This might seem, described plainly, like a small breach of privacy, letters left visible to the whole household rather than delivered discreetly and directly, but it functioned within the specific logic of Constance's world almost as the opposite, a kind of visible proof that the household's correspondence was healthy, active, properly maintained, an empty letter rack morning after morning being read correctly as a faint but real social warning sign, evidence that a family's wider network of friendship and obligation might be thinning in ways worth quietly worrying over. Constance checks the rack herself most mornings before Edmund even comes down, a small, habitual glance that tells her in an instant roughly how the coming day will need to be shaped around whatever replies are now expected of her. The particular fabric of Constance's evening dress tonight, that deep plum silk we mentioned earlier, deserves one more small detail before I let the image of it go entirely. Silk of this quality, in this era, was almost never an English product from start to finish, the raw material typically arriving from silk-producing regions further east, or from established European centres with long traditions of silk weaving, spun, dyed and woven by processes that involved genuinely skilled, genuinely underpaid labour at every single stage before the finished bolt of fabric ever reached a dressmaker's shop in London, where Constance selected it 18 months ago for what she remembers, even now, as a slightly extravagant afternoon of indulgence. She has never traced the full journey of that particular bolt of silk back to its actual origin, has never really had reason or occasion to, and it sits now, brushed and returned to its form in the wardrobe for the night. One small finished object at the very end of an enormously long, entirely invisible chain of labour stretching halfway around the known world, exactly the kind of quiet global thread that runs underneath so much of what feels, from inside a North London drawing room, like a purely local, purely domestic life. The bustle beneath that same dress, now removed and set aside on its own small stand in the corner of the dressing room, works through a genuinely different mechanical logic than the crinoline it replaced, a structure of steel half-hoops and horsehair padding designed specifically to project volume backward from the waist, rather than spreading it in the full circular silhouette an earlier generation favoured, and Constance remembers finding the whole contraption faintly absurd the first time Sarah helped her into one several years ago, an opinion she kept, as she keeps most of her genuinely irreverent opinions about fashion, safely to herself rather than voicing it anywhere it might actually be overheard by someone who took the current silhouette rather more seriously than she privately did. There is a particular quiet to households now, past 1 in the morning, that I think deserves one last moment of your attention before we let Constance go fully to sleep. It is not silence exactly. Old houses like this one are never entirely silent, a floorboard settling somewhere on the stairs as the temperature drops another degree overnight, the faint tick of the inherited carriage clock downstairs, wound faithfully by Edmund only a few hours ago, the occasional soft shift of whiskey resettling himself at the foot of the bed. It is, instead, a specific kind of collective stillness, an entire household of people and animals suspended together in the same protected hour, none of them yet needing to be anything other than simply, quietly asleep. No calling cards to manage, no seating charts to redraw, no notebook to hide, only the plain, unremarkable fact of rest, shared by everyone under this particular roof at exactly the same time, on this particular ordinary Wednesday morning in November, in a century that felt, to everyone living inside it, exactly as real and exactly as unremarkable as your own does to you right now. One last small thread before the quick ones, because I think it belongs here more than anywhere earlier in the evening. Constance's own mother, now in her 60s and living quietly in a smaller house not far from where Constance grew up, still keeps, framed on her own mantelpiece, a lock of hair from a sister who died in infancy decades before Constance was ever born, a small dark curl set behind glass in a plain gold frame that has hung in every house her mother has ever lived in, moved carefully from wall to wall across more than 40 years and at least 4 different addresses. Constance's mother speaks of this sister rarely and always gently, a grief worn smooth by an enormous span of time rather than a grief that has ever fully closed, and Constance has come, over the years, to understand that particular small gold frame as a kind of quiet anchor point for her mother, proof that a person who lived only a handful of weeks still occupies a real permanent place in the family's memory, still gets acknowledged, still gets kept, in the specific and very Victorian way that this century kept its dead close, rather than tucking grief discreetly out of sight, the way later generations would sometimes learn to do instead. Constance thinks of this framed curl sometimes when she looks at her own children sleeping upstairs, a small private reminder, never spoken aloud to anyone, of exactly how much ordinary luck sits quietly underneath an ordinary happy household, and how thin the line has always been, in every single century including this exact one, between a life that gets to unfold in full and a life that gets folded, instead, into a small lock of hair behind glass. I think, too, of the particular way this century managed conversation about money, since it threads quietly through nearly every scene we have walked through tonight, without ever once being named directly at any of them. It was considered genuinely improper among people of Constance's class to discuss actual sums of money in almost any social context. An income might be broadly gestured at through the language of comfortable or well-situated, or the specific coded phrase a good match, but stating an actual figure aloud in company was treated with roughly the same discomfort a modern person might feel discussing their own salary at a dinner party. Constance knows, in the broad comparative sense, that everyone in her circle seems to know, without ever quite saying so, roughly where the Ashby household sits relative to her sister-in-law's household, or Louisa's, or the Whitmores, a whole invisible ranking that every woman in her circle carries constantly in her head, assembled from 100 small visible clues: the number of servants kept, the quality of a dress's fabric, whether a family kept its own carriage or, like the Ashbys, still walked or hired a cab, all of it discussed everywhere and never once discussed directly, a fascinating, exhausting kind of fluency that Constance has simply absorbed over years of practice without ever once being formally taught it by anyone at all. And I think, finally, of the particular resilience this century asked of nearly everyone living inside it, servants and mistresses alike, each in their own very different register. Mrs. Handley rising before dawn for decades running, Sarah hauling water up 3 flights of stairs twice daily without complaint, dreaming quietly of a better position a few years off, Constance herself, managing an entire invisible architecture of obligation, performance, and genuine private thought, all folded together into a single ordinary Tuesday that nobody watching from outside would ever think to call remarkable. None of them, I suspect, thought of their own lives as containing anything worth an evening's careful telling a century and a half later. That is, I think, the quiet gift buried underneath all of tonight's strange, curious little facts, the reminder that an entirely ordinary life, examined closely enough and patiently enough, turns out to be considerably stranger and considerably richer than it ever felt from the inside. There is a small ritual specific to this exact time of year that I nearly forgot to mention, and I think it fits well right here, at the very edge of sleep. In the coming weeks, as the household moves properly into the Christmas season, Constance will begin the yearly task of assembling small gift baskets for several of the poorer families in the parish. A basket for each containing tea, a length of warm flannel, perhaps a small joint of meat, delivered personally rather than sent by a servant, since the visiting itself was considered as much a part of the obligation as the goods contained within the basket. This kind of organized personal charity occupied a genuinely significant portion of a respectable woman's yearly calendar, understood not as optional generosity so much as a real, expected duty attached to her particular social position, and Constance approaches it each year with a mixture of genuine warmth and a faint, rarely examined discomfort at the specific choreography of the whole exchange. A well-dressed woman arriving at a poorer family's door with a basket of exactly the goods that family cannot easily provide for itself, both parties understanding perfectly well the shape of the transaction, even as both play their expected parts within it graciously. She has never quite resolved how she feels about this particular yearly duty. Admiration for its genuine, tangible usefulness, sitting alongside a quieter unease about everything the ritual assumes and leaves entirely unquestioned, and she suspects, without ever having said so to another living soul, that this small recurring discomfort is itself one more thing this whole century has taught her to carry quietly and never mention at the dinner table. The last thing I want to mention is smaller still, almost nothing, and yet it has stayed with me since I first came across it. Pressed inside the front cover of Constance's own prayer book, the one she carried to church only this past Sunday, sits a single dried flower, a violet, flattened now to little more than a papery shadow of its original colour, placed there on her wedding day 9 years ago and never once removed since, carried, unnoticed by anyone else, to every single church service she has attended in nearly a decade of marriage. Nobody has ever asked her about it. She has never offered an explanation. It is simply there, small and private, and completely hers, one more tiny, unremarkable, entirely ordinary object, holding an entire private world inside it, exactly the way so much of what we have walked through together tonight turned out to hold far more than its plain, quiet surface ever let on. Even the act of falling asleep itself carried its own small, quiet ritual in this house. One final thing worth mentioning before the quick ones. Constance says every single night without fail, a short private prayer of her own devising, learnt from her own mother and passed down, she imagines, from a chain of mothers stretching back further than anyone in the family could properly trace. A handful of simple sentences of gratitude and hope murmured silently rather than aloud, said now, as always, with her eyes already closing, Edmund's breathing already slow and even beside her, before the whole shape of her mind finally lets go of the day entirely and drifts, at last, into sleep. Outside, the last cab of the night finally passes, its wheels loud for a moment against the cobblestones before fading again into the general hush, and somewhere further off, so faint it barely registers, a dog barks twice at nothing in particular before falling silent itself, the whole neighbourhood settling, street by street, house by house, into exactly the same deep, unremarkable stillness that has already claimed the Ashby household entirely. There is a particular smell, too, that belongs only to this exact hour, in this exact house. Coal smoke gone cold and faint in every chimney, the ghost of tonight's dinner still lingering very slightly in the air near the stairs, the warm, clean scent of the rosewater Constance patted onto her own skin not 20 minutes ago, all of it settled now into something soft and indistinct, the particular smell of a house that has finished with the day entirely and is simply, quietly, waiting for morning. And beneath all of it, quieter than any of the small sounds or smells we have just named, there is simply the fact of 9 years, the specific accumulated weight of 9 winters spent in this exact bed, 9 Novembers of exactly this kind of quiet, ordinary night, each one folding gently into the next until the whole stretch of them together starts to feel, from the inside, less like a sequence of separate days and more like a single long, warm, continuous thing that Constance is still, gratefully, gently living inside. One more small, final image, and then truly the quick ones. If you could stand right now at the foot of Constance's bed, in the near total dark, letting your eyes adjust slowly the way hers never needed to tonight, you would see very little beyond shape and shadow, the pale rise of the pillow, the dark curl of whiskey at the very edge of the blanket, the faint steady rhythm of 2 people breathing in the particular unison that 9 years of sharing a bed eventually produces without either party ever consciously working toward it. Nothing about the scene would look remarkable to you. That, I think, is exactly the point. Tomorrow will bring its own small round of ordinary tasks, lighter than today's, and the day after that, lighter still perhaps, or not. The shape of any given week never entirely predictable even within a life as carefully scheduled as this one. But none of that belongs to tonight. Tonight belongs only to rest, hers and, I hope, yours as well. So let the house stay dark a while longer. Let the coals go on cooling quietly in every grate. Let Constance sleep, and Edmund beside her, and Sarah and Mrs. Handley 2 floors up, and the children above them still, and the cat curled warm at the foot of the bed, all of it settled, all of it still, an entire small world holding perfectly steady until morning finds it again. There is nothing more urgent waiting anywhere in this story tonight, no secret left to reveal, no small crisis left to resolve, only the plain, complete fact of an ordinary day finished properly. lived the way 10,000 days very much like it were lived across this exact stretch of the century by women whose names mostly went unrecorded, whose small private rooms and small private notebooks mostly stayed exactly as private as Constance intends hers to remain, and whose real, full, complicated lives were never quite as simple or as small as the soft focus portraits history sometimes prefers to remember them by. I keep thinking actually about how many other households on this exact street, this exact night, are settling into some close variation of the very same rhythm we have followed inside the Ashby house. Fires banked, children checked one final time, a husband and wife exchanging some small quiet word before sleep finally claims them both, each house believing itself, in its own private way, to be simply living an ordinary life rather than participating in anything as grand as history. And yet here we are, a century and a half later, and it is precisely that ordinariness, examined closely enough, that turns out to hold everything worth remembering. Let me leave you with a small handful more before we finally close the light entirely, quick ones, the kind that might follow you gently down into sleep rather than needing much unpacking. A respectable Victorian gentleman never removed his hat indoors except in a private home, a church, or in the presence of a lady, a rule so deeply ingrained that men of this era developed an almost unconscious fluency in the small, constant calculus of exactly when a hat came off and when it stayed firmly on. A lady's handkerchief, carried always, embroidered often with her own initials, served a genuinely wide range of small social functions beyond its obvious practical purpose. Dropped, according to popular legend more than documented widespread practice, as a small deliberate signal of romantic interest to a gentleman she wished to encourage, though Constance, much like her skepticism about the language of fans, has always privately suspected this particular custom belonged rather more to romantic fiction than to any woman she has actually known in her own circle of friends. A birthday, oddly enough to modern ears, was celebrated with considerably less fuss in Constance's world than a name day would have been in some other parts of Europe, or than a wedding anniversary is within her own household. Birthdays acknowledged warmly within the family, but rarely marked with the elaborate parties and presents that would come to define the occasion in later decades, a small, quiet difference in emphasis that Constance has never thought twice about until turning it over in her mind just now, that late in the evening, the way small, unremarkable facts sometimes only become visible once you hold them up right at the edge of sleep. Umbrellas, black and sturdy, were considered an essential part of any respectable person's wardrobe against London's famously unreliable weather, but carrying one open indoors, even briefly, even by accident, while shaking off rain in an entrance hall, was avoided with a genuine, if largely unexplained, superstitious unease that Constance shares without ever having questioned where it originally came from. One more small inherited habit passed down so many times that its original reasoning, whatever it once was, has long since worn away entirely, leaving only the habit itself still faithfully observed. And one final small detail, the kind I think belongs exactly here, at the very last edge of the evening. Constance's wedding ring, a plain gold band, sits on her hand tonight exactly where it has sat every single night for 9 years, and beside it, worn only on formal occasions, a garnet ring that was Edmund's grandmother's before it became hers, small deep red stones set in an old-fashioned gold mount that Constance has never particularly loved for its beauty alone but has come, over the years, to love for everything it carries with it. 3 generations of women's hands, 3 generations of exactly this same quiet, unremarkable, entirely ordinary kind of life, women rising before dawn, or being woken by servants who rose before dawn on their behalf, managing households and raising children and writing letters and, in at least one case that nobody else in the family will ever know about, keeping a small locked drawer of private thoughts that the rest of the world was never meant to see. The candle on Constance's own nightstand, the last small light left burning anywhere in the house, gutters gently and goes out on its own within the next few minutes, the wick finally spent, and the room settles into the same complete, comfortable darkness that has already claimed every other room in this quiet brick house on this quiet street in North London. Somewhere outside, very faintly, a church clock strikes the half hour, 1:30 into a Wednesday morning, that will, in a handful of hours, bring the fires and the hot water and the ironed newspaper and the whole familiar architecture of another entirely ordinary day. But that is hours away yet. For now there is only this: a house gone fully quiet, a family gone fully still, a cat curled warm at the foot of a bed, and a woman finally completely asleep. I hope, wherever you are tonight, in whatever city, whatever room, whatever quiet corner of the world you have chosen to spend this hour with me, that you are drifting somewhere just as peacefully as Constance is right now. Thank you for spending this evening here, in this strange, ordinary, endlessly interesting century, and for letting me walk you through it slowly, one small curious detail at a time. If any part of tonight stays with you, the arsenic wafers, the stuffed kitten, the notebook behind its false panel, let it settle in gently rather than keeping you turning it over too actively. There is nothing more for you to do tonight except rest. Sleep well, my friend. I will see you again soon, on another quiet night, in another corner of the past.